The desert doesn't care if you live. But Ward Sample does, and that makes him dangerous. Pecos West. Chapter 1. The bus smelled like recirculated regret. Ward Sample had been on it since El Paso, 4 hours of Chihuahuan. Desert sliding past the window, in shades of tan and amber and the particular gray-brown of caliche dust that settled on everything west of the Pecos and never quite came off. The AC unit above his head leaked a thin stream of condensation onto his left shoulder and made a sound like a man trying to clear his throat quietly in church. Sample had moved his duffel twice to catch the drip. He'd stopped after the second time. Some problems you manage and some problems you accept, and a wet shoulder somewhere outside Ozona was the kind of problem that didn't rate a third attempt. He sat in the second-to-last row, left side aisle seat. Old habit. From here, he could see the full length of the bus without turning his head, the overhead luggage racks, the pale ovals of faces in the headrests, the driver's mirrors catching highway and scrub, and the occasional dead armadillo baking in the breakdown lane. The Glock 19 sat in his waistband at the 4 o'clock position under an untucked cotton flannel, the color of old brick. The flannel had a button missing at the 3rd position, and he'd been meaning to replace it for 2 years. He'd bought it at a Walmart in Tucson the week after he turned in his credentials, and it fit the way cheap clothes sometimes fit a lean man. Acceptably, without enthusiasm. The man in the window seat across the aisle had been talking since San Antonio. His name was Fitch. Sample had caught it off the luggage tag on the roller bag he'd muscled into the overhead rack with the labored drama of a man unused to physical effort. Cornelius Fitch, the tag read, with a Columbus, Ohio address and a phone number that suggested business card had been stapled to the tag at some point and removed. Fitch was maybe 55, dressed in the way of men who have money, but not taste, good fabric cut wrong, shoes that cost $400 and looked like $300, a golf shirt in a shade of yellow that no one in the natural world had ever chosen. He was telling someone on his phone about a land deal in Reeves County, the kind of deal that involved water rights and investors, and the word opportunity deployed at a frequency that made the word meaningless. "You don't understand the aquifer situation," Fitch said. "I'm not sure you're hearing what I'm telling you, Derek." Sample looked out the window. The desert out here had a specific quality in July that people who hadn't seen it got wrong. They pictured sand dunes, Lawrence of Arabia stuff, romantic emptiness. What the Chihuahuan desert actually offered in midsummer was a flat, relentless hostility, ocotillo and lechuguilla, and creosote in every direction, the ground the color of old bone, the sky a bleached white that wasn't quite blue, heat shimmer rising off the asphalt in waves that made the horizon look unstable. It was the kind of landscape that didn't hate you. It just didn't care whether you made it through or not. It's not a water rights issue, Derek. It's a water rights opportunity. The woman in the seat directly ahead of Sample had not moved in 40 minutes. Mrs. Adela Pruitt, Sample had heard her introduce herself to the driver in Ozona with the directness of someone stating a fact rather than offering a pleasantry, sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the seat back in front of her. She had iron gray hair cut short and practical, and she wore a blue chambray shirt tucked into khaki trousers, and the posture of a woman who had spent 40 years in ranch country and considered slouching moral failing. She hadn't touched the phone in her purse. She hadn't opened the paperback on the tray table. She was simply sitting the way people who live with real silence can sit without needing to fill it. 3 rows up, the young man named Tomas had one earbud in and his forehead tilted against the window glass. He'd said maybe 12 words. Since Del Rio. Early 20s, construction calloused hands. Backpack with a broken zipper pull that he'd fixed with a twist of wire. He was watching the desert with the specific patience of someone who understood that distances in this country were not poetic, they were just distances and you waited them out. The driver, Heck Yarborough, had the build of a man who'd been large once and was now settling into himself the way old mountains settle, slower, denser, less interested in impressing anyone. He had a photograph clipped to the dash, a woman and 2 teenage boys on a boat squinting into the sun. The photo had been there long enough that the edges had curled and the colors had shifted toward yellow. Yarborough drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the window ledge, elbow out, the way men drive when they've driven this road so many times, the road has become part of their nervous system. Sample watched the mile markers. He was going to Tucson because he had a storage unit there with 3 years of files in it, and he had an appointment on Monday with a former colleague from the El Paso field office who had agreed, reluctantly and over 2 beers, to look at what Sample had built and tell him whether it was enough, whether it would move. The files concerned a private equity firm called Rafter J Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, operating out of Albuquerque and involved. Sample believed, with the particular certainty of a man who has cross-referenced the same names across too many documents in too many states, in the acquisition of water rights across the Permian Basin, through a chain of shell companies that existed specifically to make the acquisition invisible. The firm had a security division. The security division had a head. The head had a name that Sample had circled in red marker on a document taped to the wall of his motel room in Las Cruces 7 months ago and not taken down since. Cole Jarvis. The name sat in Sample's chest like a small cold stone. "You're going to thank me in 18 months, Fitch said. "You're going to call me and say, Cornelius, you were right about this." Outside, a buzzard turned lazy circles above something dead in the mesquite. The heat shimmer ate its reflection off the asphalt and put it back wrong. Chapter 2. The SUVs came out of the ranch turnoff, doing 90. Sample saw them before anyone else because he was looking at the right window, and because he was the kind of man who cataloged things other people's eyes slid off. 2 black Tahoes and a Silverado crew cab, all of them the same flat black that wasn't factory paint, paper plates on the Silverado, moving in a formation that was too deliberate to be anything but rehearsed. The lead Tahoe pulled ahead and cut across the bus's lane. Yarborough hit the brakes, not panic, just reflex, the brake pressure of a man who's been driving long enough that his feet move before his brain catches up. The bus settled with a pneumatic sigh. Sample already had the Glock in his hand, held low against his thigh, concealed by the seat back in front of him. The lead Tahoe stopped crossways on the highway, blocking the lane. The second Tahoe pulled alongside the bus, driver's side, and stopped. The Silverado rolled up behind and stopped. 3 points on a triangle. The bus in the middle. Whoever ran this operation had done the geometry in advance. The passenger door of the lead Tahoe opened, and a man stepped onto the asphalt. He was large, not bodybuilder large, but working large, the size of a man who moved heavy things, with a shaved head and wraparound sunglasses, and an AR pistol on a single-point sling that he'd let drop to his chest in a way that said armed, without pointing the barrel at anyone yet. He walked toward the bus door with the unhurried stride of a man arriving at an appointment he'd made himself. From the rear of the bus, Sample watched Yarborough open the bus door. There was a moment where he might not have, but the second Tahoe's window came down and the geometry of the situation communicated itself, and Yarborough opened the door. The man with the AR pistol stepped up and onto the bus. He was maybe 40, with a flat, broad face and the flat, broad attention of someone who processed a room by eliminating threats rather than identifying individuals. His eyes moved front to back, in a single sweep. He stopped 2 rows behind the driver and planted his feet shoulder width, the AR pistol still at his chest, and said in a voice calibrated for exactly this space, "Nobody needs to do anything. We're going to be off your bus in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Somebody had timed this. A woman in the 3rd row made a sound, and the man looked at her without expression, and then looked away, which was somehow worse than if he'd said something. A child near the front started to cry, and his mother pulled him against her shoulder and whispered to him. Fitch had gone the color of old chalk. The man, Sample would learn the name Del Swick later from the phone in his jacket pocket, scanned the bus again, and his eyes passed over Sample, the way eyes pass over someone unremarkable in the back row, which was exactly what Sample had arranged with his posture and his loose flannel, and his hands resting open on his thighs. The Glock was below the seat back. Invisible. Outside, through the window, 2 men had dropped from the second Tahoe and moved to the rear of the bus, to the cargo bay doors. Sample could hear the latch, the hydraulic lift. They knew which bay. Somebody had the manifest, or had bought somebody who had the manifest. 3 rows up, Tomas had both earbuds out. He was very still. Mrs. Pruitt had not changed her posture at all. Swick walked the aisle at a pace that suggested he wasn't worried about what he'd find. His right hand rested on the AR pistols. Receiver, easy, the way a man rests his hand on a doorknob he's opened 1,000 times. He passed row 5. Row 6. His eyes went to the overhead racks, to faces, to the floor between seats. A professional inventory. He reached row 7 and stopped. He was looking at Mrs. Pruitt's purse. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to put your hands on the seat back. In front of you." Mrs. Pruitt looked at him. Her expression was the one Sample had seen on women who had moved through hard country long enough that they classified threats on a longer scale than most people, what was actually dangerous and what was merely loud. She put her hands on the seat back. "Thank you," Swick said. He turned. Sample came out of his seat. Not fast in the way that registers as fast, not a lunge, not a sprint. Just a sudden elimination of the distance between the back of the bus and the space behind Del Swick's left shoulder, 3 steps that use the aisle and the seatbacks and the bus's slight forward pitch, and then his left hand caught Swick's right wrist and drove it down and forward, breaking the grip on the AR pistols. Receiver, and his right arm came across Swick's throat from behind. In a bar choke that had nothing theatrical about it, just bone and pressure and leverage, the basic physics of cutting off blood supply to a brain. Swick was strong. He drove backward, trying to pin Sample against the seats, but Sample had his feet braced against a seat leg and pivoted with the pressure, keeping the choke, and they went sideways into the aisle, and Sample rode him down. The AR pistol clattered against the floor, and Sample kicked it forward under the seats away. It took 11 seconds. Swick went slack. Not unconscious, not quite, but his hands dropped away from Sample's forearm, and his legs stopped working in any coordinated fashion. Sample kept the pressure for 2 more seconds, and then released, grabbed the back of Swick's collar and put him face down in the aisle with a knee in the small of his back. The bus was silent, except for the idling engine and the child, who had stopped crying and started watching with enormous eyes. Sample looked up the aisle at the Silverado through the windshield. The 2 men at the cargo bay, both of them had heard something, or felt it, in the way a job sometimes communicates that it has gone wrong. He pulled the suppressed SIG from Swick's thigh holster, a P320 suppressor already threaded, which told him something about the preparation involved, and moved to the front of the bus in a low crouch, past Yarborough, who sat with both hands on the wheel and was doing exactly the right thing, past Mrs. Pruitt, who had not moved her hands from the seat back in front of her, but was watching Sample with those measuring eyes, and he stopped at the front step and fired once through the open door into the Silverado's windshield. Low center safety glass. The round punched a starred hole, and the windshield became opaque, and the driver came off the seat in a way that said he hadn't been hit, but was no longer interested in finding out if the next one would change that. The 2 men at the cargo bay looked at each other. In situations like this, and Sample had been in enough of them to have a working theory, the men who ran were survivors and the men who pressed were casualties, and most people who hadn't signed up to die knew which one they were. These 2 ran. They grabbed Black Pelican case from the cargo bay, threw it into the Silverado's bed with a hollow aluminum sound, and the Silverado moved. The lead Tahoe moved. The second Tahoe, the one that had held the perimeter, burned rubber pulling a U-turn, and all 3 vehicles went north on a county road through a ranch gate that was open and waiting for them. 42 seconds. The cloud of caliche dust hung in the air above the county road and drifted south on the wind and slowly became part of the general atmosphere of West Texas. Chapter 3. Swick was awake and unhappy and disinclined to conversation. Sample had cable tied his wrists behind him with a phone charging cable from the overhead bin, Fitch's, which felt appropriate, and sat him in a window seat with his cheek against the headrest. The shoulder was dislocated. It had happened when Sample brought him down, and Swick had discovered it when he tried to move his right arm and produced a sound like a man biting down on something he hadn't expected to be there. "The shoulder's going to need a doctor," Sample said. "You'll want to tell me something before that becomes a longer wait." Swick looked at the seat back in front of him and said nothing. Sample went through his jacket. A Gerber multi-tool. A granola bar, half-eaten roux-wrapped. $40 in a money clip with no credit cards. And a burner phone, Samsung, screen cracked in one corner, with one outgoing text sent at 11:47, 23 minutes before the SUVs had come out of the turnoff. Jarvis confirm. 36 hours. Sample looked at that for a while. On the keychain in Swick's left front pocket, 3 keys and a rectangular fob with an embossed logo, an R and a J serif font. Intertwined. Rafter J Holdings, LLC. The kind of corporate branding that shows up on executive key fobs and letterhead and the signage of buildings that don't advertise what happens inside them. He turned the fob over in his fingers. Outside, the desert sat in the heat and said nothing back. 3 years of files in a storage unit in Tucson. The Monday appointment with a man who had agreed reluctantly over 2 beers to tell him if it was enough. Cole Jarvis. The name like a small cold stone. He pocketed the fob. Yarborough had both hands on the wheel again and was watching Sample in the mirror with the steady gaze of a man who had been through enough that his categories for this kind of thing were broader than most. He didn't look frightened. He looked like he was waiting to find out what came next, which was the right posture. Get this bus to the first town with a gas station, Sample said. When you get there, I need your cell phone. I'm going to call a number in San Antonio. FBI, not the locals, I'll explain why. And I'm going to tell them what we have here and what direction those vehicles went. You hold the bus there until they arrive. Sanderson's 12 miles, Yarborough said. Maybe 15. That'll do. Mrs. Pruitt had turned in her seat. She looked at Swick against the headrest, at the cable tie, at the dislocated shoulder held in the geometry of a man who had learned not to move it. Then she looked at Sample. You going after them, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. She reached into her purse and produced a folded piece of paper. The kind of deliberate production that suggested she had thought about this in the last 4 minutes and arrived at a decision. She held it out. The Ruiz family has a ranch off the county road, 8 miles north. Second turnoff, past the water tower. They'll know the terrain. Sample took the paper. You know them, he said. I know everyone from here to the river, Mrs. Pruitt said. This is my country. She turned back around and put her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the passing desert with an expression of complete equanimity, as though the last 11 minutes had confirmed something she already knew, and she was content to leave it there. Fitch said, Should I mean, is there something I should? No, Sample and Mrs. Pruitt said at the same time without looking at each other. Chapter 4. Sanderson was 12 miles. A water tower, a Dollar General, a feed store with a hand-lettered sign advertising deer corn, striped station with 3 pumps, and a deli counter that had been serving breakfast burritos since 1987 and showed no signs of stopping. The bus pulled into the Stripes lot and sat with its engine running while Sample made 2 phone calls on Yarborough's phone, the FBI field office in San Antonio, a woman named Tran, who knew his name and went quiet in a particular way when he said it, which meant she was writing, and then walked to the equipment yard of a ranch supplier 3 blocks down, where a sun-faded 2009 F-150 sat with its windows down and the keys in the cup holder, which in Sanderson in July was either negligence or trust and was the same thing anyway. He left a handwritten note on the feed store's bulletin board with Yarborough's name and cell number and the words Blue F-150. Stripes lot will be returned. Whether that was legally sufficient, he didn't know. He knew a man in Albuquerque who could sort it out, if it came to that. The county road north was a numbered ranch road with no center stripe and cattle guards every 2 miles, the kind of road that the state puts in and then forgets. Sample drove with the windows down, because the F-150's AC was a memory and the air outside, even at 102 degrees, moved. The caliche. Dust came through the windows and settled on his arms and the seat and the cracked dashboard. He drove north, following a cloud of dust that was settling. Back to Earth 3 miles ahead, the residue of 3 vehicles. Moving fast through a landscape that remembered everything and forgave nothing. In his jacket pocket, Swick's burner phone. Jarvis confirmed. 36 hours. And the fob with its intertwined R&J turning over and over. In his mind like a coin, both sides the same, both sides the one he didn't want to look at. The road went straight north into the heat shimmer, and the truck went with it, and whatever waited at the end of it would wait the same whether he hurried or not, but he pressed the accelerator down to the firewall anyway, because some decisions you make with your foot. Chapter 5. The tire tracks were easy for the first 6 miles, and then they weren't. The county road north of Sanderson ran straight as surveyors. Spite through flat ranch country, a few pump jacks nodding in the distance, cedar and sotol crowding the bar ditches, fence lines sagging where the posts had rotted at the base, and nobody had gotten around to caring. The 3 vehicles had pushed hard up this road, that much was clear. The Silverado's tires left deep impressions in the soft caliche shoulders where it had pulled wide around a cattle guard, and the Tahoes had followed. In the same line, the lead truck's tracks overriding the second ones in places, which told Sample they were moving fast enough. That spacing had collapsed. Men in a hurry. Men with a timeline. Jarvis confirmed. 36 hours. At mile 6, the road hit a T-intersection, west to a ranch headquarters visible as a water storage tank and a cluster of corrugated roofline a mile off, north up a 2-track that the county had given up pretending to maintain. The 2-track had a cattle guard and a gate beside it, the gate still standing open. Chain hanging loose. The tracks went north. The dust on the gate's hinge post had been knocked loose recently, the clean metal underneath bright against the surface rust. Sample took the 2-track. The F-150 registered every rut and rock through the steering column in a way that suggested the front end had accumulated some opinions about its life. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the track ahead and the scrub on either side, watching for the kind of stillness that meant someone standing in brush, waiting to see what followed them. The scrub showed him nothing. Scaled quail scattered from a cedar clump. A roadrunner stood in the track ahead with the philosophical composure of a bird that has calculated exactly how long it can hold its position before it needs to move, and held it. Then the tracks changed. He almost missed it, a widening in the track where the caliche gave way to exposed limestone shelf, 20 feet of natural hardpan where rubber left no impression. On the far side of the hardpan, the surface went soft again, and what came out the other side was different. Different tire pattern. Bigger footprint. A Ram 2500 or a heavy Suburban, something with dual rear wheels riding low, the impressions deep enough that whatever it carried put real weight on that axle. They'd swapped vehicles in the blind spot the limestone provided. Thought about that in advance. Had the second vehicle staged and waiting at a spot where the surveillance, any surveillance, aerial or ground, would have a gap. Sample got out and crouched over the new tracks. The left rear tire had a screw lodged in the tread, pressed flat. It would leak slow, maybe 20 miles before it caused trouble, maybe 100. He worked the Gerber multi-tool out of Swick's jacket pocket, which he'd transferred to his own in Sanderson, and used the blade to scratch an X in the caliche beside the track. In case anyone needed to find this spot later. In case he needed to point someone back to it. The original 3 vehicles were gone, dispersed somewhere in the brush, or doubled back to the highway while he'd been on the phone in Sanderson. The 3 vehicles were decoys, and containment, the operation's muscle, and the real move had been the ram, staged up here, waiting for the case to arrive. He got back in the truck and followed the ram's tracks north, into country that got rougher and more certain of itself with every mile. Chapter 6. The man sat on the hood of the second Tahoe with his right hand pressed against his chest and his face the color of old putty. Sample came around a bend in the 2-track, and there it was. The Tahoe pulled off into a wash where a dry creek had cut through the limestone and left a flat gravel bed 20 feet below road level. The vehicle sat nose into the creek bank, with its driver's door hanging open and a man on the hood who had been there long enough that his shirt had soaked through. In the July heat, a dark oval of sweat spread across his back, like a map of somewhere unpleasant. Sample stopped the F-150 across the wash entrance, cut the engine, and sat with the cig in his right hand resting on his thigh, watching the Tahoe and the brush around it for 30 seconds. Nothing moved. The man on the hood had his head down, and his good hand pressed to his chest, and was breathing with the shallow, deliberate attention of someone managing pain on a budget. Sample got out and walked down into the wash. The man heard him coming and raised his head. He was maybe 35, sandy-haired with the broad shoulders and thin waist of someone who worked out or used to, and the pale, slicked face of someone who had been sitting in a dry creek bed in 102-degree July for the better part of an hour, with a wrist that had gone the wrong direction. The wrist was swollen at the joint, the skin over it stretched and shiny, a way that suggested the bones inside had an argument going. Sample kept the cig down at his side, not pointed, not holstered. "Arch Poble," the man said. His voice had the flat, slightly surprised quality of someone in enough pain that introductions felt abstract. "I know who you are." "Do you?" Swick described you before. He moved his jaw the way men move their jaws when they're trying to determine if something else has gone wrong that they haven't cataloged yet. Swick. "Make it." He's in Sanderson with a dislocated shoulder, waiting for a federal agent who is going to have extensive questions for him. Poble absorbed this. He looked at his wrist. He looked at the limestone wall of the wash, which had nothing to offer. FBI. That's right. A long pause. Scaled quail were calling somewhere up on the flats, a sound like a rusty hinge, rhythmic and indifferent. The creek bed smelled of dry rock and old water, and the particular mineral emptiness of places that only exist as themselves during flash floods and are otherwise waiting. "My wrist," Poble said. "I can see that. I need a hospital." "You need to answer one question first." Poble looked at the cig, still down at Sample's side, and then looked away from it, which was the smart move. The cig was not the point, and Poble seemed to understand that, which told Sample something useful about Poble's experience with this kind of situation. Sample crouched and opened the F-150's passenger door from behind the frame, old habit, putting metal between himself and an unknown, and pulled the water bottle from the cup holder. He walked it down into the wash and held it out. Poblé took it with his left hand and drank half of it without stopping. "You didn't have to do that," Poblé said. "No." Sample unwound the bandana from around his own neck. The one he'd been wearing since Las Cruces, dusty as everything else, and crouched in front of Poblé and splinted the wrist against the Gerber multi-tools handle with the bandana wrapped firm but not tight. The multi-tool was the right length. Poblé made a sound through his teeth and then stopped making it. "That's going to hold it for a few hours," Sample said. "You won't want to jostle it." Poblé looked at the improvised splint. Something moved across his face, not gratitude exactly, more the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he thought he had figured out. "You're not a cop anymore," Poblé said. 3 years retired. "So what are you?" "Right now, I'm the man asking you one question." Poblé drank the rest of the water. He set the empty bottle on the hood beside him and looked out at the far wall of the wash, where a seam of quartz ran through the limestone in a white diagonal line, catching the afternoon sun. "Jarvis," Sample said. The name sat between them in the heat. Poblé laughed, a thin, aspirated sound that had no pleasure in it, and a fair amount of something else. He looked at his wrist and then at the quartz seam, and then at Sample. "You don't want to ride into Jarvis," he said. "I'm not being dramatic. I'm telling you this because you splinted my wrist and gave me water, and you're going to go up there anyway. And I'd rather tell you what you're walking into than have you find out the hard way and die thinking I didn't warn you. Tell me about Jarvis." So Poblé told him. Chapter 7. Cole Jarvis had been a lot of things before he was Cole Jarvis. In the way that mattered now. Army Ranger, 2 deployments. The kind of service record that looks clean because the parts that aren't clean don't appear in the record. Then, 11 years as a security contractor, the kind of contractor that private equity firms hired when an acquisition ran into complications, which was the word the firms used when they meant that someone was standing between them and something they decided they owned. Jarvis had a gift for making complications resolve. The method varied. The resolution was consistent. He'd gone independent 4 years ago when a PE firm in Denver had decided he knew too much about 3 specific resolutions in New Mexico and needed to be the kind of problem that resolved itself. Jarvis had resolved it the other direction. The 2 men they'd sent came back with a message, and the message was that Jarvis was keeping the file he'd built on the firm as professional insurance, and anyone who wanted to discuss the matter was welcome to come discuss it in person. Nobody had come. After that, he'd built Rafter J Holdings, a legitimate shell, a real LLC with real assets, a real Albuquerque address, real letterhead, real executive key fobs, because Jarvis had the particular vanity of men who operate in gray space and want the surface to shine. The security division was the real business. Acquisition, recovery, asset transfer, counter-surveillance. The kind of services that didn't appear on the website because the website didn't exist. The Water Rights Consortium, a group of 8 investors, mostly Texas and New Mexico money, operating under a Delaware holding company called Aquifer Capital Partners, had hired Rafterjay 8 months ago to facilitate the acquisition of bearer bond instruments from a wire transfer clearinghouse in Midland. The clearinghouse held the bonds as collateral for a land note that had gone sideways. The bonds were worth $4.2 million on paper. Aquifer Capital wanted them because the bonds, converted through a land broker in Albuquerque, who asked no questions as a professional courtesy, would become clean wire transfers that funded the next phase of their water rights buy. The buy that would give them controlling interest in the aquifer that sat under 6 counties of the Permian Basin, the aquifer that Cornelius Fitch had been describing to Derek as an opportunity 2 hours ago on a bus, the aquifer that in 20 years, if the climate models ran the way the climate models were running, would be worth more than the oil beneath the same ground. Jarvis had set up the intercept, bribed a clearinghouse employee for the transfer manifest and schedule, hired the crew, 8 men rotating, nobody knowing more than their piece, set up the vehicle swap on the limestone shelf, had the ram and its driver staged at Creosote Wells for 48 hours in advance. Creosote Wells, the old Huff Ranch on the north slope of the terrain above them, Poble said, an hour's drive up roads that weren't on Google Maps. The Huff family had run cattle there for 3 generations, and then the drought of 2011 had taken the cattle, and the note had taken the land, and a sequence of LLC transfers that would take a forensic accountant a week to untangle had deposited the property in the portfolio of a holding company that traced, eventually, and through enough layers to discourage the tracing, back to Rafterjay. Jarvis had been using it as an operations base for 6 months. Game cameras on the perimeter, a generator, the old limestone main house with 4-foot walls and window placements that a former ranger would appreciate, a steel equipment barn that backed up to a rock face on the north side and had 1 entrance and no blind spots if you were inside it. How many men with him? Sample said. Poble thought about it with the care of a man who understood that the answer mattered. 4, maybe 5. Dickie Rawls runs security. He was a federal marshal before he wasn't, which is a long story and not a good one. There's a kid named Hayes, ex-Army, wound tight. Merriman you saw at the bus. And Santos. He's not exactly crew. He's more like a contractor Jarvis uses when he needs someone with specific regional knowledge. Guara's background. Knows the terrain up here better than anybody. Jarvis himself. Poble looked at the wash wall again. I want to tell you something about Jarvis. Go ahead. He's not hot. That's the thing people get wrong about him. You expect someone who does what he does to run hot, to be, I don't know, aggressive, loud, some kind of alpha energy. He's not any of that. He's quiet, the way a room is quiet after something bad has happened in it. He thinks before he moves, and when he moves it's already over. Poble paused. He's going to know someone is coming. He had eyes on that bus situation, remote feed off the game cameras at the vehicle swap point. He knows Swick didn't make it back. He's already adjusted. Sample stood up. He walked to the Tahoe and tried the door. Locked. He looked through the glass at the center console, a phone mounted in a cradle, charging cable still attached to the port, the screen dark but a notification light pulsing green. Keys, Sample said. Poble reached into his left jacket pocket with his left hand and produced a fob, a twin to the one Sample had taken off. Swick, the intertwined R&J, he held it out. Sample took it, unlocked the Tahoe, and pulled the phone from the cradle. The screen woke, a lock screen with no passcode, which said something about Poble's operational security that he probably didn't want said about it. The GPS track log was still running. Sample scrolled back through the breadcrumb trail, south on 285, west on a ranch road, north on the 2-track, a stop of 43 minutes at a coordinate he didn't recognize that sat between the limestone shelf and the Creosote Wells property line. A waypoint. Probably a gate with a combination lock and a key code that changed on a schedule. He noted the coordinates on the back of Mrs. Pruitt's folded paper with the Gerbers all pressing the numbers into the paper. The all left clean impressions in the paper's back and ghosted through to show as raised dots on the front like braille. I need the gate code, Sample said. The one between the limestone shelf and the property. Poble was quiet. I'm going to go up there regardless, Sample said. The code saves me time on the gate. That's all. Another silence. The quail calling on the flats. The sun making its slow and indifferent work on everything below it. 4772, Poble said. Changes every Sunday. At midnight. Today's Friday. I know what day it is. He locked the Tahoe and left the phone on the hood beside the empty water bottle where someone could find it. In his jacket pocket he had Swick's burner, which was probably clean of anything useful to the FBI, but would matter if he needed to send a text that looked like it came from inside the operation. He'd think about that on the drive. He started back up the wash to the F-150. Poble. He turned. I'm going to call 911 from the burner in about 2 hours and give them this location. He looked at the splinted wrist, the heat-sick posture, the man on the hood of a truck in a dry creek bed in July. You want to stay in the shade of the wash until then. The limestone holds cool longer than the surface. Poble looked at the shade on the east wall of the wash. Still thick and blue at this hour. He slid carefully off the hood and walked to the wall and sat down with his back against the stone and his splinted wrist across his lap. Sample, he said. Yeah. He knows your name. Jarvis. He pulled your record after Swick's text. Sample waited. He said, Poble stopped. He looked at the quartz seam in the limestone, the white diagonal catching the low sun. He said a man like you should be done with this kind of work. The air moved, dry and hot, carrying the smell of cedar and something mineral from the rock, and below that the faint ghost of the last rain, which had been in April. He's not wrong, Sample said. He walked up out of the wash. Chapter 8. 2 miles north of the wash, the 2-track intersected. Better road, still unpaved, still county forgotten, but wider and graded at some point in recent memory, the kind of road that suggested regular use by vehicles that weren't embarrassed to use it. The ram's tracks went left, northeast. The road curved with the terrain, following a ridgeline that built gradually out of the flat country below, cedar giving way to juniper and pinon as the elevation lifted, the rocks redder and more insistent. Sample drove it. He had Swick's burner in his shirt pocket and Mrs. Pruitt's folded paper on the dash and the cig with 8 rounds in it. On the passenger's seat, the Glock was in his waistband still. 15 rounds, 1 in the chamber. Swick's AR pistol was in the cargo bed, under a tarp he'd found behind the seat. Because a man carrying a slung rifle into an operation in bright daylight on open terrain was a man who had given up any advantage surprise offered. He would leave it with the truck when he walked in. He thought about what Poble had said. He's going to know someone is coming. This was probably true. The game camera at the vehicle swap point, if Jarvis had it feeding back to a monitor at Creosote Wells, and Sample had to assume he did, would have caught the F-150 coming north, would have caught Sample's face. When he stopped to read the tracks in the caliche, Jarvis would have a face. Jarvis, Poble said, already had a name. A man like you should be done with this kind of work. What Jarvis hadn't factored, what no one had factored who looked at Sample from the outside and did the arithmetic, was the thing about the files in Tucson and the appointment on Monday and the name circled in red marker on the wall of the Las Cruces motel room. The math didn't account for the 3 years. The 3 years changed the calculation in ways that weren't visible from outside the 3 years. He wasn't here because the bus had been hijacked. He was here because Cole Jarvis had reached from Albuquerque into a bus on I-10 and touched something that Sample had been tracking for 3 years with the specific, unhurried certainty of a man who knows the direction he's going even when the road isn't marked. Jarvis had shortened the timeline, had pulled the problem out of the abstract, out of documents and depositions and a storage unit in Tucson, and made it concrete and present and parked on a county road in West Texas. Sample could work with concrete. At the waypoint coordinate from Poble's GPS log, he found the gate, a steel pipe gate padlocked with a 4-button keypad. On the post, he entered 4772. The lock cycled. He swung the gate, drove through, got out and locked it behind him. Because a man who locks a gate behind him is a man who belongs on this side of it. The road climbed through the juniper. The evening light came in flat and amber from the west, throwing long shadows off the cedar posts and the limestone outcroppings and the occasional prickly pear clump that had colonized a gap in the rock. At this altitude, the heat had a different quality. Still fierce but moving, a dry wind off the high ground that carried the smell of heated rock and dried grass and something resinous from the juniper. A mile past the gate, he stopped the truck and got out and climbed a limestone shelf that put him 8 feet above the road and looked north. The compound sat in a shallow bowl where the slope leveled out. A quarter mile away, maybe 3/8. The old Huff limestone house, long and low with a rusted metal roof and a covered porch along the south face. The steel equipment barn behind it and to the left, big enough for 4 or 5 vehicles, one rolling door facing south. A generator shed. Beside the barn, a gravel lot between the house and the barn, with a portable light tower in it, the kind construction crews use, unlit now in the late afternoon. And on the posts along the perimeter, at intervals he counted, as he scanned left to right, the game cameras. 6 of them that he could see. The near field ones covered the road approaches. The far field ones, he'd need to find the far field ones when he went in on foot. 2 men visible in the gravel lot. One sitting on a folding chair beside the barn door with something on his lap, a tablet or a phone. 1. Walking a slow, irregular pattern. Between the house and the generator shed, the irregular pattern of a man patrolling without conviction, going through a motion rather than executing a doctrine. The irregular walk was a tell. Either this man had no real training or he had real training and had been at this post long enough to stop caring about the details. Both versions were useful in their own ways. The Ram 2500 sat at the barn's east corner, driver's side, visible, back to the wall. The Pelican case was inside the barn, or it was inside the house. He put it in the barn because a man like Jarvis would want it accessible and close to a vehicle, not inside a structure with limited egress. The light tower in the gravel lot would come on after dark. The generator would cycle. He remembered what Poble had said about the limestone house walls, 4 feet a ranger's appreciation for what 4-foot walls meant in a firefight. He also thought about what Poble hadn't said, which was anything about the game camera's recording interval or who was watching the feed. He climbed down from the limestone shelf and got back in the truck. He drove it 2 miles back down the road, off the grade into a cedar break where the canopy was thick enough to break up the truck's outline from above and killed the engine. The cedar closed around the F-150, and the silence moved in to fill the space the engine had left. He sat and watched the light change. The sun hit the top of the ridgeline and went red, and then the red faded to orange, and then the orange faded to the blue-gray that comes before full dark in high desert country. A color that exists nowhere else, a color that has the quality of something held in suspension between 2 states. The first stars came out above the eastern horizon, sharp and immediate the way stars are at elevation. The generator, at the compound 1.5 miles north, started and ran and cycled down, and the light tower in the gravel lot threw a hard white sodium glow into the darkening sky. He watched the glow. He had the SIG and the Glock and 11 rounds total in the SIG and 15 in the Glock plus a spare magazine for the Glock in the duffel. He had the Gerber multi-tool, the bolt cutters he'd found behind the F-150's seat and put back there on the assumption they might become useful, and the specific knowledge bought at the cost of 3 years of cross-reference documents and a storage unit in Tucson, and an appointment he was now going to miss on Monday. Of who Cole Jarvis was, and what Cole Jarvis had built and what Cole Jarvis was in the process of doing to a thing that Sample had spent 3 years trying to stop. He ate the half granola bar from Swick's jacket pocket. It tasted like oat and chalk and the faint petroleum ghost of whatever had been in that jacket pocket before the granola bar arrived. At 10:15, he got out of the truck and locked it and walked north through the cedar toward the sodium glow, moving without a light, letting his eyes adjust to what the stars and the compound's distant glare offered, which in open desert country was more than people thought, and enough for a man who knew how to use it. The juniper made no sound in the wind. His knee felt fine. He noted this with the specific, private acknowledgement of a man who has learned not to trust fine. Chapter 9. The game cameras ran on a 90-second loop. Sample had timed the first one from behind a juniper stand 200 yards south of the compound's outer fence, a cedar post strung with old barbed wire, 4 strands, the kind of perimeter that existed to define a property line. Rather than stop anything serious, the camera sat on a T-post 20 feet inside the wire, facing south-southeast. And every 90 seconds, its IR illuminator cycled off for 3 seconds before it cycled back on. The 3-second gap was the tell. The illuminator threw a faint red wash against the brush in its field of view when it ran, invisible to the naked eye, at distance but not invisible to a man who had been watching it for 20 minutes and knew where to look. 3 seconds every 90. A window the width of a breath. The technology was at least 4 years old. Jarvis had installed it when he took the property and hadn't upgraded it, which meant either the budget hadn't warranted it or he hadn't anticipated needing better. A man who thought he hadn't been found didn't invest in the hardware that assumed he had. Sample filed that. He worked east along the fence line, staying below the ridge that ran parallel to it, using the terrain the way terrain is meant to be used, not fighting it, moving with it, the low spots and the rock outcrops and the cedar clumps doing the work that cover is designed to do. The sodium tower in the gravel lot threw light in a hard cone that flattened. At the edges and outside that cone, the desert had the particular darkness of high elevation with no ambient glow. For 50 miles, the stars ran edge to edge overhead. The Milky Way laid across the sky like something spilled, bright enough to cast faint shadows off the limestone outcrops. He found the second camera at the compound's east corner. Same model, same loop, slightly different timing, 87 seconds, which meant it had been installed separately, or its internal clock had drifted. He watched it through 2 full cycles and then moved. The fence wire at the east corner had a gap at a post where the staple had pulled free, decades of thermal expansion and contraction working the metal loose from the wood. He eased through without touching the wire, staying low, crossing the 20 feet of open ground between the fence and the barn's east wall in the 3-second window between illuminator cycles, and put his back against the corrugated steel. The barn wall was warm against his shoulders. The steel had been absorbing July heat since sunrise and was giving it back now in the dark, a slow radiation that cut through his shirt. He stood against it and listened. From inside the barn, nothing. The Ram 2500's engine ticked as it cooled, a sound like a metronome losing interest. The generator ran in its shed 40 feet away, a steady diesel thrum that laid over everything else and made the everything else harder to hear. From the gravel lot south of the barn, a chair scraping. A man's voice, single syllable, the way men talk when they're talking to themselves without meaning to. Sample moved along the barn's east wall to the north corner, went around it, and stopped. The north face of the barn back to a limestone shelf that rose 8 feet above the barn's roofline, a natural wall. The reason Jarvis had chosen this particular structure for this particular purpose. No approach from the north. No window in the north wall. The only entrance was the rolling door on the south face, which faced the house and the lot, and the light tower's cone. He worked back along the north wall, low to the east corner. Again, then south along the east face until he could see around the barn's southeast corner, into the lot. The man in the folding chair had a phone in his lap now. Screen up, the blue light of it painting the bottom of his face. He was maybe 30, compact, with a dark beard and the inward posture of someone absorbed in whatever the screen was showing him. His sidearm was on his right hip. A rifle, AR platform, standard configuration, leaned against the barn door to his left, close enough to reach. In 2 seconds, far enough that reaching for it would be a visible decision. The man's name, Sample was reasonably certain, was Cull Merriman. Merriman had been at the cargo bay doors on the bus. He had the same flat cap efficiency as the rest of Jarvis's crew, professional enough to be useful, not professional enough to notice that watching a phone screen in a tactical environment was an argument for your own irrelevance. The second man, the irregular walker, was not visible. Sample held at the corner and waited. 40 seconds. A minute. The generator cycled and ran. Merriman scrolled something on his phone. An owl somewhere in the juniper to the east called once and got no answer. Then the walker came around the generator shed from the west, hands in his jacket pockets, and crossed the lot at the loose, distracted pace of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. He went to the house's covered porch, stepped up onto it, and disappeared through the front door without looking back. 2 men in the lot, now 1. Sample gave it 3 minutes. The door stayed closed. The porch stayed empty. The generator ran. He moved. Chapter 10. Merriman never heard him coming because of the generator. This was not luck. Sample had spent 40 minutes at the fence line calculating what the generator's noise floor covered and what it didn't. At this distance from the east, it masked footsteps on gravel below a certain pace. The pace that didn't feel urgent. The pace of a man who belonged here. He came around the barn's southeast corner at that pace, keeping the barn wall at his right shoulder, staying outside the direct throw of the light tower, in the edge zone, neither lit nor dark, the zone where peripheral vision loses resolution and the brain fills in what it expects to see rather than what's actually there. Merriman looked up from his phone once, a reflex, and looked back down. The brain had filled in, someone from the house. Moving normally, nothing to register. Sample covered the last 8 feet. He took Merriman's collar with his left hand and drove his right forearm across the man's throat, lifting and pulling back simultaneously, the chair going forward as Merriman's weight transferred, and then the chair was empty and Merriman was horizontal, Sample's forearm across his windpipe and Sample's knee in the center of his back, and in the time it takes to lose blood pressure to the brain, 9 seconds. If you're precise about the pressure, 12 if you're not. Merriman's hands went from gripping Sample's forearm to resting on the gravel. Sample lowered him. Merriman's chest rose and fell, alive. Would stay that way, would wake with a headache and a profound, professional humiliation. He zip-tied Merriman's wrists with the 2-pack he'd taken from the duffel before he left the truck, and pushed him against the barn wall in the shadow below the door track, where the light tower's cone didn't reach. Left the phone face down on the gravel beside him. The screen would time out in 2 minutes. The barn's rolling door had a standard slide latch, a steel bar and 2 brackets padlocked. The padlock was a master laminated, the kind that resists bolt cutters. He hadn't brought the bolt cutters. He'd left them in the F-150 on the working assumption that he'd need them somewhere obvious, and the obvious place was usually wrong. He studied the latch hardware. The brackets were lag-bolted To the door frame, not the door itself, the frame. Old. Installation. The lag bolts had surface rust at the heads, working loose over years of the door's vibration. He took the Gerber's flathead driver and put it in the slot of the upper bracket's lag bolt and turned it, and the bolt gave a quarter turn before resistance, and he turned it back the other way and worked it, loose, tighten, loose. The way you back out a screw that doesn't want to come. And in 90 seconds, the upper bracket pulled free from the frame with a soft tick of metal on metal. The latch bar dropped. The padlock hung useless from the lower bracket. He rolled the door 18 inches, enough to enter sideways, and slipped inside. Chapter 11. The barn smelled of motor oil and dry wood, and the faint sweetness of alfalfa from some previous decade when the Huff family had kept horses here. The Ram 2500 sat in the center of the space, taking up most of it, backed in with the tailgate toward the rolling door. 2 quads against the west wall, covered with canvas tarps. A workbench along the north wall, with a row of padlocked pelican cases on it, 3 of them all identical, all black, all roughly the same dimensions. Sample stood inside the door and let his eyes adjust. Cataloged what the available light gave him, a thin bar of sodium glow coming through the 18-inch gap behind him, the red standby light of a wall-mounted security panel. Beside the workbench, a green indicator light on a power strip below it. 3 cases on the workbench. One had a biometric latch, and the others had standard combination locks. He went to the biometric one first. It was the outlier, and outliers were usually right. He pressed the latch. It read no registered print, and stayed locked. He went to the combination cases. The first had the factory combination still set, 000, which either meant it held nothing worth locking, or the man who packed it had the operational security instincts of a junior in a college dorm. He popped it and found charging cables, a portable battery pack, and a spare Glock magazine. The second case had a real combination and a weight to it that changed the room's geometry. He could feel the mass of it before he touched it, that specific density that money has when it's been compressed into documents. He worked the Gerber all through the zip on the soft foam gasket at the case's edge, prying the seal, and the case didn't open, but it gave enough to confirm what was inside by feel. Envelope material. Stiff paper. The particular rigidity of bonded financial instruments in a sealed sleeve. This was the one. He looked at the security cable that anchored it to a ring bolt in the workbench frame, 5 feet of braided steel, looped through the case's handle and locked with a barrel lock. He did not have the bolt cutters. He cataloged this calmly, without the specific internal profanity the situation probably warranted. The ring bolt itself was welded to a steel plate that was lag bolted to the workbench's rear frame, and the workbench was bolted to the wall studs, and the wall studs were set in a concrete pad, and the sum of all that was, the case was not moving without the bolt cutters. He needed the truck. He could bring the truck to within a quarter-mile walk. The bolt cutters in, and be back in, he ran the math. 25 minutes minimum, assuming no complications. On the return approach, a lot could complicate in 25 minutes in a compound that held 4 armed men and a principal who had already adjusted for the news that someone was coming. He was still working the problem when the barn door rolled open another foot, and Pinto Hayes stepped inside. Chapter 12. Hayes was ex-Army the way some men are ex-Army, not a thing they'd been and moved past, but a thing that had gotten into the wiring and stayed there, reorganizing how the system ran. He moved with the specific, compressed readiness of someone whose nervous system had been calibrated by places that punished hesitation, and he held the compact pistol. A Glock 43 subcompact, the kind carried by people who want a gun on them at all times and find full-size frames inconvenient, in a two-handed grip that was textbook and immediate, and pointed straight at the center of Sample's chest. He was 25, maybe 26, with a lean jaw and eyes that moved fast across the space. Sample the ram. The workbench, back to Sample, the inventory of a man looking for what he'd missed rather than what he'd found. Step away from the bench, Hayes said. Sample stepped away from the bench. He kept his hands where Hayes could see them, the SIG in his right hand pointed at the floor, not holstered, not raised. The specific geometry of, I have a weapon and I'm not pointing it at you, and you should think about what that means before you make a decision. Hayes saw the SIG, and the geometry tightened around his eyes. Put it down. No, Sample said. But I'm not going to raise it. Unless you make me. I will shoot you. I know you will. That's a decision you can make. Sample kept his voice at the level of a man discussing something that doesn't require raised voices. Before you make it, ask yourself who sent you in here to check the barn. He glanced at nothing the way a man glances at a watch that isn't there. 10:40 at night. Was that Jarvis? Or did you come on your own? A small pause. The kind a man takes when a question has landed somewhere he didn't expect. Merriman didn't check in, Hayes said. Merriman's outside. He's fine. He's going to have headache. Sample watched Hayes's eyes. You came in alone. Rawls is right behind me. Rawls is in the house, Sample said. I watched you come in the door 40 minutes ago. There's been one man in this lot since then, and it was Merriman. Another pause. Hayes was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not coming out the way he wanted it to. What do you want? Hayes said. The case on the bench. That's all. After that, I'm gone, and you go tell Jarvis whatever you want to tell him. That case is worth. I know what it's worth. That's why I'm here. Hayes looked at the workbench, at the security cable, at the bolt cutter's absence, at Sample's hand with the SIG pointed at the barn floor. The nervous energy that came off Hayes was not the energy of a man who was afraid. It was the energy of a man with a well-maintained engine running too hot, in a low gear, the kind of surplus that doesn't have anywhere to go in a static situation, and finds its own outlet if you wait long enough. Sample had met this configuration before. It was dangerous precisely because it didn't require a decision. It just required a trigger. Hayes fired twice into the left corner of the barn, where the shadows were thickest, where a man might have been standing if he'd been standing there. The shots were loud in the steel enclosure, not the suppressed, discreet work of the earlier operation, but full report. Pistol fire that bounced off the corrugated walls and the concrete floor and went straight through the ceiling and into the July night. Not at Sample. Not at anything. The trigger that didn't require a decision had found its outlet in the dark corner. But the sound had already done what sound does. Lights came on in the house. Sample moved. He went over the workbench's near end in one motion. Left hand on the bench surface, cig in his right legs. Clearing the edge, and came down on the far side in the narrow space between the bench and the wall, crouching. Putting the bench mass between himself and Hayes. The security camera's red standby light was 6 inches from his face. The wall panel beside it had a circuit breaker row on the right side, and a single key hanging on a nail above the power strip. A key on a nail above the power strip. He reached up and took it. The key was small, barrel lock, the same profile as the security cable's barrel lock on the bench above him. Hayes was moving. Sample could hear him, the footsteps. The scrape of the ram's door handle as Hayes used the truck for cover, the specific silence of a man getting low and trying to reacquire a target that had moved on him. Hayes was good. Hayes had processed the situation and found a defensible position faster than most would. The problem was that from Hayes's position behind the ram, he couldn't see the narrow space behind the bench. Sample stood up behind the bench, used the key on the barrel lock, it turned clean, the cable loop released, and lifted the Pelican case off the bench. 41 pounds. He'd estimated right in the wash. He set it on the floor behind the bench and looked at the barn door. Still 18 inches open, the sodium light painting a pale stripe across the concrete floor between him and it. 20 feet of open floor. "I can see you," Hayes said from behind the ram. He couldn't. If he could see Sample, he would not have announced it, because men who can see what they're pointing at shoot rather than speak. "Last chance to walk away from this," Sample said. "The hell you talking about, last chance? There are 4 men in this compound. 3. Merriman's outside, and he's not walking anywhere. For a while. And Santos," he paused, calculating, "Santos has already made his assessment." A short silence. Hayes processing that Santos was not where Hayes thought he was. "Rawls," Hayes said loudly. "Rawls." The barn door rolled open the rest of its travel. Dickie Rawls filled it. He was large in the specific way that suggested his dimensions had been arrived at through function rather than effort, not the gym-built symmetry of maintained muscle, but the dense, settled mass of a man whose body had been doing hard things for 40 years and had organized itself accordingly. Former federal marshal. The long story that was not a good one. He held a short-barreled shotgun, a Mossberg 590, Sample noted. The tactical version with the ghost ring sights at the compressed carry position, which meant he'd come from inside and had cleared the doorway before he raised the gun, which meant he had real training that had not atrophied. He stood in the lit doorway and looked into the dark interior of the barn and said, "Hayes." "Back right corner," Hayes said. "Behind the bench." Rawls stepped to the left of the doorframe, out of the backlight. A good move. Now he was a shape in peripheral darkness rather than a lit target, and the shotgun was up. Sample set the Pelican case down gently on the concrete behind the bench. He kept the cig in his right hand and, with his left, found the circuit breaker panel on the wall beside him by touch and worked across the breakers until he found the one labeled LT Main in faded marker. The light tower outside went dark. The barn went fully black. Rawls fired once in the direction of the breaker panel. Reflex, the shot going high and to the left, the muzzle. Flash, strobing the whole interior for a tenth of a second. And in that tenth of a second, Sample was already moving. The case in his left hand, his right shoulder dropping. Below the bench line, crossing the open floor toward the door in the strobed image of where the door had been. He hit the door frame with his shoulder, found the edge. Went through. Behind him, Hayes fired twice more into the dark interior. Neither round came close. Outside, the compound was dark, the light tower's cone gone, the generator still running but the circuit broken. And Sample ran. Not a sprint. A controlled run, the Pelican. Case swinging from his left hand, 41 pounds pulling. At his shoulder with every step, the SIG in his right hand. Pointed down, moving northeast toward the fence line and the gap in the wire, and the 2 miles of cedar break between him and the F-150. He made it 15 yards. Then the portable floodlights mounted on the barn's south face, a separate circuit, battery-backed, the kind used at construction sites, came on. And the gravel lot went white. Chapter 13. Sample stopped. Not froze, stopped. The distinction mattered because one was paralysis and the other was a decision. He stopped and dropped to one knee with the Pelican case on the ground beside him and the SIG up, and put the floodlights themselves in his field of view and identified the battery pack below each one and put 2 rounds into the nearer battery pack. The near floodlight went out. The second one stayed on, enough to half-light the lot. Enough. He picked up the case and ran for the fence. He was 12 feet from the wire when Santos stepped out from behind the generator shed. Santos was not what Sample had built in his head from Poble's description. He was smaller than the description implied, compact still with the particular economy of movement of someone who had learned in environments where excess motion drew attention. He held a pistol, a Browning high power, older than everything else in this operation, the kind of gun a man carries because it was given to him by someone whose judgment he trusted, at the low ready, not pointed at Sample, not pointed away. The space between them was 10 feet. Santos looked at Sample. He looked at the Pelican case. He looked back at the barn, where Hayes was somewhere in the dark shouting for Rawls. He looked at the remaining floodlight, one half of what it had been, throwing a skewed oval of light across the gravel that reached neither of them where they stood. He looked at Sample again. "I need to get past that fence," Sample said. Quiet. Conversational. The tone of a man stating a fact to another man who has most of the same information. Santos said nothing. He looked at the fence. He looked at the dark country beyond it, the cedar and juniper and the limestone shelf, and the 2 miles of nothing before the truck. He stepped back. Not far. Just enough. 1 step toward the generator shed. Out of the line between Sample and the gap in the wire. The high power stayed at the low ready. His face stayed neutral, the face of a man completing an internal transaction that had nothing to do with the people watching. Sample held his eyes for 1 second, the acknowledgement that passed between men who had just understood each other without the inconvenience of language, and then he went through the gap in the wire, the Pelican case catching the bottom strand and pulling it taut before clearing. And he was on the other side and moving north-northeast. through the dark cedar toward the stars. Behind him, the remaining floodlight went out. Not from another shot. Just out. Battery, or a hand. On a switch. He didn't look back to determine which. He ran. The cedar brush pulled at his arms, and the limestone outcrops rose from the dark without warning, and he went over one with his right foot, and felt the ankle roll, and caught himself on the pelican case, and kept going. 41 pounds of momentum that pulled him back to his feet before the fall, fully committed. The knee was fine. He noted this, and kept running. He found the F-150 by the silhouette of the cedar canopy. Where he'd parked it, a gap in the canopy's skyline. Outline, the truck's roofline below the gap. He came around the front bumper and got the keys out of his jacket pocket and had the door open in one motion. Then the voice came from the dark to his left. Go ahead and put the case in the truck. Calm. Not loud. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it had never had to compete for a room. Quiet, the way a room is quiet after something bad has happened in it. Sample put the pelican case on the passenger seat. He kept his hand on the doorframe and turned. Cole Jarvis stood 12 feet away in the cedar shadows. And he was exactly what Poble had said he was, and nothing more or less. Compact, fair-haired, gone to gray at the temples, with pale eyes that caught the starlight at an interval that was slightly off, that blinked at the wrong moment the way eyes do when the brain behind them is running a separate process from the face. He wore a dark jacket over a dark shirt, and he held a SIG P226 in his right hand, suppressor threaded, pointed at Sample's chest, with the specific, unperformed stillness of a man for whom pointing a gun at another man was not a significant event. He looked at the case on the passenger seat. He looked at Sample. You got further than I thought you would, Jarvis said. Case is going with me, Sample said. I understand that's your position. Jarvis tilted his head slightly, a fractional movement that contained something that was almost appreciation and almost amusement, and was entirely neither. What I don't understand is why a man with your record is standing in a cedar break in Terrell County at 11 at night holding a stolen pelican case instead of, I don't know, consulting, teaching. You were a good agent. Those skills have legitimate markets. I'm aware. And yet, Sample agreed. The generator thrum carried faintly from the compound. A mile and a half south. The stars overhead ran their indifferent inventory of light. Somewhere in the cedar, a nighthawk made its electrical buzz once and went quiet. I looked at your file after Swick's text, Jarvis said. 3 years building a case on Rafter J. That's patient work. Serious work. A pause. Work that's not going to move, you understand. The magistrate in Albuquerque has interests that align with ours, and the state attorneys in New Mexico and Colorado have been aware of that alignment for 2 years. I know about the magistrate, Sample said. I know about the state attorneys. It's in the file. Jarvis looked at him. The off-interval blink. Then you know the file doesn't go anywhere. Not through those channels, Sample said. A silence. The nighthawk again. The cedar moved in a dry breath of wind off the high rock. You're not here about the file, Jarvis said. Not. Question. Working it out. The file is why I was on the bus, Sample said. You're why I'm here. Jarvis turned this over. Sample watched him do it. The stillness that wasn't stillness, the process running. Beneath the flat expression, the man who thought before. He moved, and when he moved it was already over. I could let you take the case, Jarvis said. Walk away. One call, and I have another 4 million in instruments from a different clearinghouse by the end of next week. You take those bonds to your FBI contact in San Antonio, and she builds a case on Aquifer Capital Partners that ties up in civil litigation for 4 years and ends in a consent decree that costs them 18 months of profit and changes nothing structural. You go back to wherever you've been living, and the file sits in its storage unit. He paused. Or we end this here, in this cedar break, and the outcome is the same. Except it's cleaner. The timeline doesn't change either. Wait. The timeline changes, Sample said. How? Because I know where you're going to be for the next 36 hours, Sample said. And I'm not the only one who knows it now. Jarvis went still in a different way. The process running. Beneath the face, shifting to a different process. Swick's phone, he said. Swick's phone, Sample said. The text. Jarvis confirmed. 36 hours. Sent to a number. That Tran at the San Antonio field office had been running for the past 2 hours. The number that traced back through 3 VoIP layers to a server in Phoenix that Rafter J Holdings paid for under a subsidiary name that was in Sample's file and therefore now in Tran's file. Jarvis looked at the dark country south of them, toward the compound, toward the sodium glow that was no longer there. Something moved across his face, not fear, not panic, something more like the expression of a chess player who has found the move he missed 3 turns ago. He looked back at Sample. You should have stayed on the bus, Jarvis said. You should have used a different crew, Sample said. In the cedar, and the dark and the long silence that followed, both things were true. Jarvis raised the cig. Sample was already moving. Chapter 14. He went left and down. Not a dive, a drop, controlled, his left knee hitting the caliche, as the SIG P-226 fired once above him, the suppressed round clipping the F-150's passenger mirror and sending safety glass across the door panel in a sound like thrown gravel. Jarvis adjusted his angle in the dark, and Sample rolled left behind the front wheel well, putting the engine block between himself and the SIG, and came up on one knee with the Glock already in his hand. He didn't fire. 12 feet. Dark. Cedar on 3 sides. The engine block between them. Jarvis moved right, trying to clear the truck's front end for an angle, and Sample moved with him, staying covered. The Glock, tracking the sound of footsteps on the caliche. Because that was what the dark gave him. A man's footstep. On loose rock had a specific acoustic profile, heel strike, weight transfer, toe push, and Jarvis's footsteps said. He was trained and patient, and not rushing the geometry. 2 professionals in a cedar break at 11 at night, each waiting for the other to commit. The Nighthawk called again, above and east. Then Jarvis stopped moving. Not the stop of a man losing his nerve. The stop of a man who had made a decision and was implementing it. Sample heard the change, the absence of footsteps, the held breath that follows a calculation, and he went low along the truck's driver's side without waiting to hear what came next, staying in contact with the vehicle's undercarriage by feel, his left hand trailing the chassis rail, moving toward the rear of the truck while Jarvis was almost certainly moving toward the front. He came out the truck's rear and stood up, and Jarvis was not there. Not on the right. Not on the left. The cedar 30 feet north moved. Not wind, directional. Lo, the movement of something with mass passing through brush. With the deliberate speed of a man who had decided that the ground he was standing on was no longer useful. Jarvis was running. Sample stood at the truck's tailgate and understood it in the same second. The phone, Swick's burner phone with its forwarded trace, was in Sample's shirt pocket. Jarvis knew this now. He'd laid it out himself in the cedar break. The 36-hour window had collapsed the moment Sample said it aloud, and Jarvis was not a man who stayed in a collapsing window. He was going back to the compound to burn it. Not the hydraulic drum against the barn wall, not Jarvis's move from the outline, the feint to flush Sample from cover. The real burn. Files. Devices. The operational record that connected Rafter J Holdings to Aquifer Capital Partners to the magistrate in Albuquerque to the VoIP server in Phoenix. To every transaction that Sample's file documented, and that Tran in San Antonio was, right now, running traces on. A man like Jarvis did not leave a compound intact when the timeline collapsed. Sample thought about this for approximately 1 second. He got in the truck. He drove without lights, the F-150's engine loud in the cedar. Quiet, following the road grade south by feel and the ambient star glow that was just enough to keep the bar ditches out of the wheel wells if he held center and trusted the crown of the road. At the gate, he killed the engine and coasted the last 50 feet, stepped out before the truck stopped moving, and opened the gate by feel the same way he'd done it from the other side 2 hours ago. The lock code still worked. Jarvis hadn't killed the perimeter system yet, which meant he wasn't there yet. Sample left the gate open and drove through and accelerated hard south toward the compound, the truck's high clearance suspension registering every rut in the ungraded road, the Pelican case on the passenger seat shifting with each impact. 41 pounds of financial instruments that the Aquifer Capital Partners Consortium had planned to use to buy 6 counties' worth of water from the ground under people who didn't know it was for sale. The compound's gravel lot opened up ahead, and Sample pulled the F-150 to the lot's east edge and killed the engine. The light tower was still dark. The generator still ran. The barn's rolling door stood where he'd left it, fully open now. The interior dark. He got out and moved to the barn door and stood inside the frame and listened. From the house, movement. Specific, focused, the sound of a man moving through a space with purpose rather than caution. Drawers. A hard-sided case, laptop bag or document. Case, hitting a surface. The particular sound of paper being gathered, stacked, compressed. Sample crossed the lot. He went up the porch steps and through the front door the way he'd watched the irregular walker go through it 2 hours ago, straight, no pause, the way a man goes through a door he's been through 100 times. The front room was a ranch house living room stripped of anything that belonged to people who lived in a place rather than used it. A folding table with 2 laptops, camp chairs, an overturned fast food bag on the floor that no one had picked up. The back of the room opened to a short hallway, and 2 doors, one of which had a strip of light at its base. Sample went to that door. Chapter 15. Dickie Rawls hit him from the left. The hallway was narrow, 4 feet, the old ranch house. Proportions of a time when hallways were passage rather than architecture, and Rawls had been standing flat against the wall beside the doorframe, and Sample had moved through the dark hallway on the assumption that Rawls was still in the barn recovering from the door, which was the assumption Rawls had constructed and waited behind. The shotgun barrel took Sample across the right shoulder. Not a shot, a strike, Rawls swinging the Mossberg like a bat in the confined space, and the impact drove Sample into the opposite wall, and the Glock went out of his hand and skidded somewhere in the dark. The shoulder lit up from inside, a deep structural pain that said the joint had moved in a direction it preferred not to, and Sample's right arm went unreliable in the specific way of an arm that's had the muscle shocked off the bone. He got his left arm up before the second swing. The Mossberg stock came down across his forearm, better than his skull, which had been the destination, and Sample took the impact and used it, pulling the stock toward him instead of away, which brought Rawls's weight forward into the narrow hallway and gave Sample his hip and the wall for leverage. He drove his left shoulder into Rawls's chest and pinned him against the door, and got his left hand on the Mossberg's receiver and pushed it sideways into the doorframe. They held there braced, 2 men and 1 gun in 4 feet of dark hallway. Rawls was stronger. Not dramatically, not in the way that made the outcome obvious, just stronger, the incremental advantage of 30 pounds of extra mass applied through a frame that knew how to apply it. Sample felt the gun rotating back toward him by degrees. He let it go. Rawls's weight came forward with the gun's sudden lack of resistance, and Sample stepped back and right, and Rawls came through the doorway into the room beyond, momentum carrying him 2 steps past Sample, and Sample's left elbow found the base of Rawls's skull as he went by, not a full swing. The hallway didn't give room for a full swing, but enough. Rawls went down onto 1 knee. The Mossberg hit the floor. Sample put his left knee into Rawls's back, and his left arm across his throat from behind, the same geometry as Merriman in the lot, and held it. Rawls's hands came up and then went away. 9 seconds. Sample released and stood, and his right arm reported back with a status that was not encouraging. The shoulder would move. The shoulder would complain about moving for weeks. He cataloged this without stopping, and picked up the Mossberg with his left hand, and carried it into the lit room. The lit room had been the ranch house's main bedroom, and Jarvis had converted it into the operations nerve center. With the portable, provisional neatness of a man who sets up and breaks down workspaces the way other men make hotel reservations. 2 folding tables along the walls. A surge protector power strip running everything. A whiteboard on a stand with the bus operation diagrammed in blue marker. The I-10 intercept point, the vehicle positions, the cargo bay timing, the vehicle swap coordinate, and the creosote Wells address written at the top right, with 36 hours beside it and a line through both, the line drawn recently, the marker still wet enough to smell. A shredder in the corner running, a drift of ribbon cut paper on the floor beneath it, where the basket had filled, and nobody had emptied it. And Pinto Hayes, standing on the far side of the left table, with his left hand pressed flat on the table surface, and his right hand hanging at his side, the right thigh of his jeans soaked dark from mid-thigh to knee. His face had gone the specific gray of a man who had lost meaningful blood and was running on the part of his nervous system that activated when the rational part had clocked out. He looked at Sample in the doorway. He looked at the Mossberg in Sample's left hand. He looked at Sample's right arm, hanging. "Where's Rawls?" he said. His voice had the texture of something dragged across gravel. "Hallway. He's breathing." Hayes looked at his right hand. His right hand was empty, and had been empty since Sample had shot it in the barn. The shot that had clipped the meat at the base of his thumb and driven the Glock 43 into the gravel. Hayes had been standing here maintaining pressure on his thigh wound with his ruined right hand as a secondary task, while his primary task was deciding what to do, which Sample could read in the expression of a man who had been deciding for a while, without arriving anywhere useful. "Jarvis is coming back," Hayes said. "I know. When he gets here. He's not going to get here the way he thinks he is," Sample said. "Sit down before you fall down." Hayes sat. The chair was a camp chair, fabric over aluminum tubing, and it took his weight with the mild protest of camp chairs everywhere. He put both hands on his thigh and looked at the ceiling. "The girl at the front desk in Marathon," he said. "I told her I'd be back by Saturday." Sample looked at him. "Just talking," Hayes said. "There's a first aid kit," Sample said. "Find it. Keep pressure on that thigh." He moved to the nearest folding table and stopped talking. The laptops were open, screens dark but not shut down. The shredder had priority. The electronics were secondary. On Jarvis's triage list, Sample hit the spacebar on the nearer machine and the screen woke to an open browser with 3 tabs, a flight booking site with a one-way ticket to Monterey, departing Fort Stockton Municipal at 6 a.m. A bank portal showing a Cayman account balance that Sample did not read in full because the number had enough digits to be distracting, and an encrypted messaging application with a conversation thread in it that had been partially cleared, and then the clearing had stopped, interrupted. He took out Swick's burner and photographed each screen. Both laptops, the whiteboard, the shredder's output basket, which would matter to a forensic analyst, even in ribbons. The flight itinerary he photographed twice from 2 angles, because the flight leaving Fort Stockton Municipal at 6 a.m. was leaving in 6 hours and 40 minutes, and that fact was either still relevant or it wasn't, and whether it was would depend on the next 20 minutes. He photographed Rawls in the hallway for the record. Rawls was on his side with his cheek against the floorboards, breathing with the deep automatic rhythm of a man the nervous system had put in standby. The Mossberg. Sample kept back in the lit room. Hayes had found a first aid kit in a duffel bag under the right table and had unwrapped compression bandage and was applying it to his thigh with the competent, joyless efficiency of someone who had done field dressings before and found no part of the experience improved by repetition. "Santos is gone," Sample said. "Santos was gone before you came through the barn door," Hayes said. "Santos has got weather vane instincts. First, wrong gust, and he's pointing the other direction. The other direction is east. Santos has family in Presidio. He always goes to ground in Presidio when an operation goes sideways. He's been doing it since 2019. Hayes looked at the compression bandage. "You can pass that along to whoever you're passing things along to." Sample looked at him. Hayes said it without looking up. Without inflection, the statement of a man who had concluded that the information had a higher value changing hands than staying where it was. Presidio, Sample said. Manuel Santos Guerrero. He's got a sister on Chibolo Street. Yellow house, the one with the satellite dish on the wrong side of the roof. Hayes tied off the bandage with the blunt motions of his left hand, doing work it wasn't built for. He's not a bad person. He's a person who made a bad series of decisions, which is a distinction worth making. I'll pass it along. I know you will. That's why I said it. Sample went back to the folding table and took the nearer laptop off its charger and closed it under his left arm. The second laptop he left, one was evidence and two was a weight he couldn't manage with one working arm and a Mossberg. He looked at the whiteboard one more time. The blue marker diagram. The line through 36 hours. The Monterey flight. 6 hours and 38 minutes now. He thought about where Jarvis was. Jarvis had gone north from the Cedar Break on foot, moving. Toward what? Toward the gate, toward a vehicle he'd staged. Outside the compound perimeter, the same forward planning logic that had put the Ram 2500 on the limestone shelf. A man like Jarvis did not operate without a staged exit. He had a vehicle somewhere on the north side, and he'd go to the compound's cached records, whatever wasn't in the lit room, whatever was off-site, and he'd make his flight and he'd be in Monterey before the FBI convoy from San Antonio reached Fort Stockton. Unless Sample went to the hallway and stepped over Rawls and went through the front room and out the porch door and across the lot to the F-150, carrying the Mossberg and the laptop and the Pelican case from the passenger seat, and he put the laptop in the duffel bag in the truck bed and the Pelican case on the passenger seat, and drove the F-150 across the lot to the barn's open rolling door and into the barn itself, parking it beside the Ram 2500 with the headlights off. He got out and went to the Ram and tried the door. Locked. He looked through the driver's window at the center console. No key fob visible, nothing in the cup holders. He went to the workbench. The key on the nail was gone. He'd taken that key. But there was a second nail beside the first one, and on it hung a ring with two keys. A GM key that fit the Ram, and a padlock key that he didn't need anymore. He took the GM key. He moved the Ram 2500 out of the barn and parked it at the lot's south edge, blocking the road that was the only vehicle exit from the compound. Then he went back to the barn, and he found the fuel drum that Jarvis had planned to use, not hydraulic fluid. He'd called it wrong in the Cedar Break. It was diesel. A 55-gallon drum on a hand truck against the east wall with a gravity spigot at the base. He rolled it into the lot's center, away from the barn, away from the house, away from the Ram. 40 feet of open gravel in every direction. He opened the spigot and let the drum run. The diesel spread across the gravel in the starlight, black and slow, filling the low center of the lot where the gravel had settled over the years into a shallow bowl. He walked back to the F-150 and sat in the driver's seat, with the door open and the Mossberg across his lap and Swick's burner phone in his left hand, and he dialed the San Antonio field office number he'd called from Yarborough's phone in Sanderson. Tran picked up on the second ring. It's Sample. I know, she said. She had the alert, unhurried voice of someone who had been awake for this and expected to stay awake. Where are you? Creosote Wells compound. I have the Pelican case intact. And a laptop that's going to need a forensics team. I have 2 of Jarvis's crew secured on site. Hayes is ambulatory. Rawls is going to need a few minutes. There's a Ram 2500 blocking the South Road exit, keys in it. I need you to put someone at Fort Stockton Municipal Airport. There's a 6 a.m. charter to Monterey that's either still relevant or isn't, but you want someone there either way. A pause. Keyboard. Jarvis. Not on site. He went north from my position on foot. Approximately 20 minutes ago. He has a staged vehicle. Somewhere on the north perimeter. He wouldn't operate without one. He's mobile, and he has a destination. The Monterey flight. If he still thinks he can make it, yes. If he's recalculated, no. I don't know which. Sample looked at the spilled diesel in the lot, the starlight catching the surface in a slow iridescent spread. There's also a man named Manuel Santos Guerrero. Juarez background, former contractor for Rafter J. He'll be at a residence on Chibolo Street in Presidio. Yellow house with a satellite dish on the wrong side of the roof. He's not violent and he's not going to run. Pass that to the Presidio County office and tell them low-key. More keyboard. Sample. A pause that was not a hesitation, more like breath taken before a specific sentence. You sound like you're doing this one-handed. The shoulder took some damage. It's manageable. We're 3 hours out minimum. Fort Stockton first. Then your position. That's fine. Is it? There's diesel in the lot, and the generator's still running, Sample said. I'm going to put some distance between myself and the compound, and wait for you at the gate. Another pause. He could hear her deciding whether to say the thing she was deciding whether to say. This is a lot of unilateral work for an unlicensed civilian, she said. I know it. We're going to have a conversation about that. I know that too. He ended the call. He sat in the F-150 with the Mossberg and the caliche dust on his arms and the shoulder reporting back at regular intervals with assessments he'd stopped reading. The diesel continued its slow spread across the gravel. The generator ran in its shed. The stars overhead maintained their indifferent positions. He was thinking about the gate code. 4772 changes every Sunday at midnight. Jarvis would change it now. Would change it from wherever his staged vehicle was, on his phone remotely, if the system allowed remote changes. Most of them did. Standard operational security when you suspected the code was compromised, and Jarvis would suspect it was compromised because Jarvis suspected everything. That touched his operation now, which meant the gate would be locked when Jarvis tried to come back through it, which was not Sample's problem. It was Jarvis's problem. It was the kind of problem that a man created for himself when he set up a perimeter system and gave the code to a man who gave it to another man in a dry wash, and that man used it and then reported it to a federal agent in San Antonio who was now running traces on the entire Rafter J operational infrastructure. The timeline. Not the one Jarvis had described in the cedar break, the one where everything Sample did resolved into the same structural outcome and nothing changed. The other one. The one where a man got on a bus in El Paso and sat in the back row out of habit, and a convoy of flat black SUVs came out of a ranch turnoff and changed what the bus ride was. Chapter 16. He heard the shot from a quarter-mile north. One shot. Suppressed, the cracked whip sound that suppressors reduced to, audible at distance as a sharp pressure rather than a report, the kind of sound that a man who'd been around suppressed weapons long enough recognized by its absence of resonance. No echo. Just the pressure, and then nothing. Sample sat forward in the seat. One shot meant one of two things. Jarvis had found an obstacle, or Jarvis had been found. The staged vehicle was north of the gate. If someone had come down the north access road while Jarvis was moving toward it. He pulled out Swick's burner and called Tran back. She picked up immediately. "Did you put someone on the north approach?" he said. "We have a Pecos County unit that was 20 minutes north of your position," she said. "I redirected them to hold at the north property boundary and not approach until we arrived. They're not tactical. Call them now and find out if they're still holding." 30 seconds of hold. The generator ran. The diesel spread. "They're holding," Tran said. "One deputy, one vehicle. North boundary, not approached. He says he heard a shot approximately 2 minutes ago, north of the property line." North of the property line. Jarvis's staged vehicle was north of the property line. Jarvis had reached it. The shot had not been at the deputy, who was alive and holding. The shot had been at something else. The shot was at a tire, Sample said. He was working it out as he said it. He took out his own tire. A pause on the line. Tran computing it the same way. Sample was computing it. "So his vehicle is disabled," she said. "His vehicle is disabled, and he knows there's a deputy on the north boundary, and he can't go back through the south gate because the ram is blocking it and the code is burned." Sample looked at the compound's lit room window, Hayes' silhouette moving inside, doing something methodical, the compression bandage or the first aid kit or some other small useful task. He's on foot in ranch country in the dark with a SIG P226. And whatever he had time to pull from the compound before I came through the front door. "How far is the nearest paved road from the north boundary?" 6 miles minimum, Sample said. "Probably 8. On foot in July, in terrain that swallowed distances. At 11:40 at night, with a deputy sitting on the boundary road and a federal convoy 3 hours out." "He's not going anywhere," Tran said. "Not a question." "No," Sample said. "He's not going anywhere. But he's going to be in the brush when you get here, and he's going to make finding him as expensive as he can." A short silence. Sample. "Yeah. Go sit at the gate. Let us do the rest of this." He thought about that. He thought about 3 years and a storage unit and a name circled in red marker on a wall in Las Cruces. He thought about Cole Jarvis in a cedar break, the pale eyes catching starlight at the wrong interval. The voice that had never had to compete for a room. He thought about the Cayman account balance on the laptop screen that he hadn't read in full because the number had enough digits to be distracting, and the 6 counties of aquifer that the number was going to buy, and the people living on top of that aquifer who didn't know it was being purchased out from under them by men in offices in Albuquerque and Denver who referred to it in documents and in conversation and probably in their own private thoughts as an opportunity. He thought about the shot from a quarter-mile north. 1 tire, he said. He only needed to flatten one. A silence on the line. He's not going to the paved road, Sample said. He was already getting out of the truck. He's going to the compound. The barn has a loft access. He's going to go to ground in the loft and wait for daylight and reassess. That's speculation. That's what I would do, Sample said. He was crossing the lot, Mossberg in his left hand, right arm held close, moving toward the dark equipment barn. That smelled of motor oil and old alfalfa and the diesel spreading slowly across the gravel behind him. Sample. Stop. He's going to set the barn on fire, Sample said. From inside. From the loft. The diesel is outside. I moved the drum, but there's fuel line running along the north wall from the generator shed. If he gets into the loft and lights that fuel line from above, it burns from the inside out, and when you get here, there's no loft and no evidence of anything. That was in the loft. What was in the loft? Sample stopped at the barn's open rolling door. He stood in the doorway and looked up at the loft's dark edge, 12 feet above the concrete floor, and listened and heard it, the specific silence of a man above him, holding still, waiting to find out what the sound at the door was going to do. He's already in there, Sample said quietly. He put the phone in his pocket without ending the call. Tran could hear everything from here. He stepped into the barn. The loft ran the full width of the barn's west end. 12 feet of plywood flooring over the original timber framing, accessible by a fixed ladder on the west wall that the Huff family had used for hay storage, and Jarvis had found useful for elevated observation. From the loft, you could see through a horizontal ventilation gap at the barn's west gable end, a 6-inch gap that ran the full width, and the gap faced west and slightly north, and gave a field of view across the compound's west approach that a man with a rifle scope could use for extended observation. What it did not give was a view of the barn's interior below. Sample understood this the way he'd understood the game cameras, not by being told, but by looking at the structure and reading what it offered. He set the Mossberg against the south wall, inside the door, out of his hands. A shotgun and a compromised right arm in a space this enclosed in the dark, with a man 12 feet above him who had not gotten where he was by making the obvious move. The shotgun was more liability than asset. He drew the Glock with his left hand and held it down. He stood inside the door and let the silence be silence. For a long moment. The generator fuel line runs along the north wall. Sample said, conversationally, to the dark above him. I know you're thinking about it. I want you to know. I'm thinking about you thinking about it. Nothing from the loft. Tran from the San Antonio field office is on an open line in my pocket, Sample said. 3 hours out. Pecos County unit, sitting on your north exit. Ram. Blocking your south exit. Gate code is burned. He Paused. You're a smart man. You know what the variables add up to. A long silence. Then, how's the shoulder? Jarvis's voice from the loft, flattened by the plywood flooring above. The same voice from the cedar break, not loud, not strained, the voice of a man having a conversation he'd already had in his head. It's had better nights, Sample said. You should have gone to the gate. Probably. Something shifted in the loft, a weight redistribution. Small and deliberate. Sample tracked it with the Glock, pointing at a spot 12 feet up and 8 feet east of the ladder. He held the bead there. The flight's gone, Jarvis said. Yes. The account in the Caymans is gone too. Tran's been running traces for 2 hours, and by now she's got the account flagged and frozen. A pause. You knew that before you called the airport. I knew it was possible. You knew, Jarvis said. He said it without heat, without accusation. The statement of a man who had done his own accounting and arrived at the same number. The file. You built it for 3 years, and it wasn't going anywhere through the official channels, and you knew that too. The magistrate, the state attorneys. You knew all of that, and you got on the bus anyway. I had an appointment Monday. The appointment was never going to move it. No, Sample agreed. But something was going to move it eventually. Things move eventually. I was going to be in the right position when it did. A silence above him that had a different texture than the silences before it. You're not a patient man, Jarvis said. Patient men don't get off a bus in Sanderson and drive a stolen truck into the back country at night. I'm patient about the right things. And impatient about me specifically. Sample said nothing. Why, Jarvis said. And Sample thought about that. He thought about it with the specific honesty that comes at midnight in a dark barn with a compromised shoulder and a gun in your left hand pointed at a ceiling, the honesty that drops the things you tell yourself in the daytime and leaves what's actually there. You built a machine, Sample said. Rafter J, the shell companies, the magistrate, the state attorneys. The buy-in with the land broker. You built it to be invisible and self-perpetuating, and when anyone got close to it, you redirected them into the parts of the system that you already owned. You built it to last. A pause. And, Jarvis said. And it was going to work, Sample said. That's why. The loft was quiet. The generator ran its diesel thrum. Sample kept the Glock on the spot 12 feet up and 8 feet east of the ladder. Come down, he said. Another silence. The barn held it, the motor oil, and the old alfalfa, and the diesel spreading in the lot outside, and the stars through the ventilation gap. At the gable end, a thin line of them, cold and sharp. And present. A boot found the first ladder rung. Then the second. Sample moved to the ladder's base and put the Glock's muzzle at the back of the knee that presented itself. At rung 3, not touching the skin, just present. The way presence communicates what it needs to without requiring language. The descent was slow and controlled and deliberate. The descent of a man who was doing this because the arithmetic was complete, not because he had run out of alternatives he was willing to use. Jarvis stepped off the bottom rung and stood facing the ladder with his hands raised and the SIG P226 in his right hand, held by the barrel, extended back toward Sample. Sample took it. He stood behind Jarvis with both weapons in one functional hand and the other arm held against his side and said, "There are zip ties in the duffel bag in the truck outside. Walk toward the door." Jarvis walked toward the door. At the door he stopped. He looked at the lot, the diesel spread in the gravel, the drum on its side at the lot's center, where the spigot had emptied it, the Ram 2500 at the road's south edge, the F-150 at the lot's east margin, the lit window of the house where Hayes's silhouette still moved in its small, deliberate pattern. He looked at it for a long moment. "The magistrate in Albuquerque," he said. "What about him?" "His name is in the file." "His name is in the file," Sample confirmed. "And the state attorney's in the file. And the Aquifer Capital Partners investor list in the file." Jarvis looked at the diesel in the gravel, the starlit spread of it. He nodded once, the nod of a man confirming something he'd suspected and was now done suspecting. "All right," he said. He walked toward the truck. Sample followed him, the SIG in his left hand and the Glock tucked into his waistband, his right arm, delivering its regular reports, which he continued to file without reading, the stars overhead running their cold inventory, the generator running its thrum, the diesel settling into the gravel of the lot of the old Huff Ranch at Creosote Wells that would belong to no one in particular for a while, and then to the county when the LLC chain was dismantled and there was nothing left to hold it up. He zip-tied Jarvis's wrists to the Ram 2500's door handle and took out Swick's burner and pulled it to his ear. Tran was still on the line. "I have Jarvis secured," he said. A short silence. "I heard most of it," she said. "Then you have what you need for the warrant." "We had the warrant 3 hours ago," she said. "The open line was for you, not for us." He stood with the phone against his ear, and Jarvis, cable tied to the Ram's door handle, and the diesel spreading in the lot, and the shoulder telling him things he already knew. "Go sit at the gate," Tran said. "For real this time?" "Yeah," Sample said. He pocketed the phone. He looked at Jarvis against the Ram's door, the pale eyes forward, the stillness settled into something that was no longer calculation. A man at the end of his arithmetic, waiting for whatever came next to arrive, and not particularly hurrying it. Sample picked up the Pelican case from the F-150's passenger seat and put it in the Ram's bed, which was where it had started the night, and drove the F-150 to the gate and parked it there and cut the engine. The gate road ran north and south in the dark. To the south, the highway was invisible but present. I-10 with its freight and its commuters and its Greyhound buses carrying people from one place to another through country that didn't care whether they made it. To the north, the compound's generator ran its thrum, the rhythm of it carrying in the still air, familiar now, the way sounds become familiar when you've been in a place long enough that your nervous system stops flagging them. He rolled the window down. The July air came through it, 101 degrees even at midnight, dry and mineral and carrying the smell of cedar and heated rock and the ghost of the last rain that had been in April and was a long time ago. His shoulder was on fire. He noticed this the way he'd been noticing it at A remove filed held at the distance that keeps a man functional when functionality is what the situation requires. The distance was getting shorter. This was information. He put both arms on the steering wheel and leaned his forehead against the backs of his hands and closed his eyes and listened to the generator and the cedar and the stars doing what stars do, which is nothing, which is enough. 3 hours. Tran would come from the south, and the Pecos County unit was already on the north boundary, and in 3 hours this particular piece of the world would be reorganized into something different, something that had federal agents and evidence bags and chain of custody forms and the long, slow machinery of an institution applying itself to a problem that Sample had brought to its door. He kept his eyes closed. The night held. He let it. Chapter 17. They came from the south at 3:14 a.m. 3 vehicles, 2 government Suburbans and a Pecos County Sheriff's unit that had come down from the north boundary when Tran radioed the all clear, their headlights sweeping the gate road in sequence, each set of lights moving through the cedar and finding the F-150 parked at the gate and the man in it with his forehead against his hands on the steering wheel. Sample heard them coming for 2 minutes before they arrived. He'd been awake. He didn't know when he had stopped being awake and wasn't certain he had, which was its own kind of information. The shoulder had been doing steady, insistent work on his consciousness since midnight and by 3 a.m. had made sleep a theoretical concept rather than an available option. He sat up. He rolled the window down the rest of the way and put his left arm on the sill. The lead Suburban pulled alongside, and the driver's window came down, and the woman who looked at him across the 18 inches of July night air between the vehicles was maybe 40, with a dark braid and wire rimmed glasses and the specific composure of someone who had been awake for 20 hours and had organized herself around the fact of it rather than fighting it. Special Agent Lucia Tran, San Antonio Field Office. 3 years of cross-referenced communications with a retired agent in various motels and storage units across the Southwest, reduced now to a face at a window in a cedar break at 3 in the morning. She looked at his right arm. Hospital first, she said. Compound first, Sample said. I have 2 men that need transport. Hayes needs an ER, Rawls needs a cell. I have Jarvis zip-tied to the Ram's door handle in the lot and the Pelican case in the Ram's bed. The laptop is in a duffel bag in the F-150's truck bed. He paused. After that, hospital. Tran looked at him with the expression of someone confirming that a thing they expected to be true was, in fact, true. After that, hospital, she said. Yes. And you'll let a medical professional look at that shoulder without arguing about it. I'll let them look at it. Sample. I'll let them do whatever needs doing, he said. After the compound. She regarded him for another 3 seconds with the evaluative patience of a woman who had learned exactly how much ground was available with this particular man, and was deciding whether the available ground was worth the effort. After the compound, she said. She put the Suburban in drive. The Stripe station outside Fort Stockton sat at the junction of US 285 and a county road, and at 6:40 the morning, it was the busiest place within 40 miles. 18-wheelers idled at the diesel pumps, their drivers already inside with coffee and breakfast sandwiches that the woman behind the deli counter assembled with the rapid, mechanical competence of someone who had been doing this since 4 a.m. and would do it until noon, and had made her peace with that. A Border Patrol unit sat at the far end of the lot with its engine running. 2 families in minivans stretched their legs at the air pumps. An old Dodge pickup with a cattle trailer attached sat across 3 spaces, and its driver stood at the hood drinking coffee from a thermos with the unhurried authority of a man who had decided that 3 spaces was exactly the number of spaces his truck required. Sample sat on a concrete parking stop outside the entrance doors with a paper cup of coffee that had been hot 20 minutes ago and was now in the transitional zone between acceptable and abandoned. His right arm was in a sling, a real one, the kind with the foam pad and the Velcro strap borrowed from the emergency kit in Trans-Suburban, because the in Fort Stockton had confirmed the partial rotator cuff tear that the shoulder had been announcing since the hallway in the ranch house, and had expressed moderate professional disapproval at the number of hours between the injury and his arrival. The shoulder would need surgery. Not immediately. The phrase the orthopedic resident had used was within the next 2 to 4 weeks, with an emphasis on 2, and there was a follow-up appointment scheduled at a facility in El Paso that Sample had written on the back of Mrs. Pruitt's folded paper, which was the only paper in his pocket that wasn't a federal evidence receipt. He had 3 federal evidence receipts. The morning was already doing what July mornings in West Texas did, which was accumulate heat in silence, the way a debt accumulates without announcement, until the weight of it becomes the dominant fact of the day. By 7, it would be 95. By 9, it would be something that required a different word. The sky had gone from the dark blue of pre-dawn to the pale chalky white that the desert wore in summer, like a coat it couldn't take off, and the mountains to the west were going purple and then brown at their edges where the light touched them. He drank the coffee. Cole Jarvis was in the Pecos County Detention Center in Fort Stockton, in a holding room waiting for the federal agents from the Albuquerque field office, who were driving down with a warrant and a case file that included, among other things, the photographs from Swick's burner phone and the contents of the laptop that the forensics team had opened at 4:30 a.m. and found substantially less damaged than Jarvis's timeline. For the shredding operation had allowed the encrypted messaging application had a recovery partition. These things happened when a man was interrupted. Dickie Rawls was in the same facility, in a different room, with a jaw that a dentist was going to have opinions about, and the specific 1,000-yard look of a man reviewing the sequence of decisions that had produced his current circumstances. Rawls had a lawyer already, had given a name within 40 seconds of his Miranda rights, which said that Rawls had thought about this scenario in advance and prepared for it, which was either impressive or dispiriting, depending on how you looked at it. Pinto Hayes was in the OR at Permian Regional Medical Center in Odessa, where a surgical team had spent 90 minutes on his thigh, and where he would spend the next 3 days as a guest of the federal government. While the wound drained, and the paperwork caught up to the facts. Hayes had given his statement to Tran's partner, a careful, deliberate young agent named Okafor, who wrote everything down in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, and the statement had included the address on Chibolo Street in Presidio and the specific detail about the satellite dish on the wrong side of the roof, unprompted, before Okafor had asked. Manuel Santos Guerrero had been at the address. The Presidio County deputy, who went to the Yellow House at 5:15 a.m., had found him on the porch with coffee, watching the sunrise, as though he had known something was coming and had decided to meet it in the open. Santos had asked, before anything else, whether anyone had been killed. The deputy had told him no. Santos had nodded and set down his coffee and put his hands out. Sample had gotten that detail from Tran at the sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway while nurse prepped him for imaging, and he had thought about it for a while, the man on the porch watching the sunrise, waiting with his hands loose. He thought about what Hayes had said. He's not a bad person. He's a person who made a bad series of decisions, which is a distinction worth making. He thought that Hayes, who had his own series of decisions behind him and a surgical team in Odessa currently working through the consequences, was probably the right person to have said it. Arch Poble had been airlifted from the Dry Creek bed. At some point after midnight, the 911 call from Swick's burner routed to the Pecos County dispatcher and acted on with a speed that said the dispatcher understood what kind of night the county was having. Poble's wrist was fractured in 2 places. He would need surgery of his own. He had declined to give a statement until he had a lawyer present, which was his right, and Tran had described his expression when the airlift crew found him as the expression of a man who had been sitting in a Dry Creek bed in a 100-degree July night for 4 hours and had decided that the legal process, whatever its flaws, represented substantial improvement in his circumstances. Del Swick was still in Sanderson, technically, in the custody of a Terrell County deputy who had been waiting at the Stripe station since approximately 1 a.m. for a federal transport that was now 40 minutes out. Swick's shoulder had been set by a physician's assistant in the back room of the local clinic, a pragmatic woman who had looked at Swick's cable-tied wrists and the charging cable and the deputy standing in her doorway and had said, "Let me guess," and had gotten on with it. The magistrate in Albuquerque had been placed on administrative leave at 5:55 a.m. by a federal oversight panel that had been, according to Tran's summary, in the hallway, aware of the concerns surrounding his conduct for some time, and had moved on them now that moving on them had become operationally simpler than not moving on them. The 2 state attorneys in New Mexico and Colorado had received calls from the Justice Department that Tran described as informational in nature, which was a phrase that contained more information than it appeared to. The Aquifer Capital Partners investor group had, as of 6 a.m., retained 4 separate law firms. Their water rights acquisition in the 6-county Permian Basin area was, per a brief statement released by one of those firms at dawn, the subject of ongoing legal review, and all transactions were temporarily paused, pending clarification of certain regulatory matters. The statement had the flat evacuated. Quality of language written by people who have just understood that the thing they were building is no longer the thing they thought it was, and who need more time than they currently have to determine what it is instead. Sample thought about those 6 counties, about the aquifer that sat underneath them in the dark of the earth, patient and indifferent and old in a way that made everything happening on the surface look like weather, temporary, local, a disturbance in the pattern that the pattern would eventually absorb. He thought about the people living above it, in the ranch houses and the small towns and the trailer parks and the edge of town properties that didn't have a proper address, the people who used the water and thought about it only when there wasn't enough of it, which was how most people thought about most of the things that held their lives together. He thought about what Jarvis had said in the cedar break, a consent decree that cost them 18 months of profit and changes. Nothing structural, and about whether that was still true. He didn't know. He knew it was less true than it had been yesterday, and that less true was not the same as untrue, but it was a direction. He drank what was left of the coffee. Chapter 18. Cornelius Fitch found him at 7:15. He came out of the Stripes entrance in fresh clothes. He'd had a roller bag, so he had options, unlike most of the people who'd been on the bus with a new coffee, and the eager, slightly feverish expression of a man who had survived something and was in the process of converting the survival into a narrative he could use. He'd been in Fort Stockton since the previous afternoon, when the FBI transport had brought the bus passengers here for statements, and he had the look of a man who had given his statement and then spent several hours in a motel room constructing an enhanced version. He sat down on the parking stop beside Sample with the familiarity of a man who has decided that a shared experience constitutes a relationship. "I've been trying to reach you," Fitch said. "They wouldn't tell me where you were." "I was at the hospital." Fitch looked at the sling. "Right, yes. Of course. How bad is it?" "Surgery. Terrible." He said it without actually processing it. The way people say terrible when they mean noted. And moving on. "I've been making some calls this morning about the aquifer capital situation. I have some exposure there, indirect but still, and my lawyer thinks that given what's come out, if I were to provide information voluntarily rather than being compelled to talk to Tran," Sample said. "Special Agent Tran. She's the one you want." Right. I'll do that." "I will." Fitch settled on the parking stop and looked at the parking lot with the expression of a man building to something. "I was thinking, I've been talking to some people this morning, journalists, a couple of media contacts. There's real interest in this story. The water rights angle, the private equity involvement, the way it was all set up to avoid oversight. It's a significant story, and the person at the center of it is Cole Jarvis," Sample said. "Well, yes. But also Jarvis," Sample said. "I'm not part of the story." Fitch looked at him. "You stopped a hijacking, recovered $4 million in stolen instruments, apprehended a federal fugitive, and dismantled what appears to be a fairly significant criminal enterprise," Fitch said with the precision of a man who had been working on this sentence. That's a significant narrative. Ward. Can I call you Ward? No, Sample said. Fitch blinked. The story is the water, Sample said. The 6 counties. The aquifer. The investors in Albuquerque and Denver who spent 3 years building a system to take it from the people on top of it without those people knowing it was being taken. That's the story. Find a journalist who knows water law and give it to them. He looked at Fitch. And when you talk to Tran about your exposure, tell her about Derek. Fitch went still. Derek from the phone call, Sample said. On the bus. The man you were explaining the aquifer opportunity to. His last name is in Tran's file, and you're going to want to be the person who brought it up, rather than the person who didn't. Fitch's face went through several phases in the space of 3 seconds, the phases of a man conducting a rapid inventory of the gap between what he'd said on a bus and what he'd said in his statement, and whether those two things were as consistent as he'd believed them to be when he said them. I should go find Agent Tran, Fitch said. That's what I said. Fitch stood up, straightened his clothes, picked up his coffee, and walked back toward the Suburbans at the lot's far edge with the brisk step of a man who has reprioritized. Sample watched him go. Mrs. Adela Pruitt was leaning against the second Suburban with her arms crossed and her eyes on the entrance when Sample looked up from the parking stop. She had been there for some time, had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been in one place long enough that the place has organized itself around them rather than the other way around. A government-issue coffee in her right hand untouched. She looked at the sling. She looked at the evidence receipts visible in his breast pocket. She looked at his face, which by this point in the morning had accumulated roughly 16 hours of West Texas and no sleep and one rotator cuff tear, and was probably expressing that fact whether he intended it or not. You look like something the creek gave back, she said. I've been told. She walked over and sat down on the parking stop that Fitch had vacated, setting her coffee on the concrete beside her feet. She sat the way she'd sat on the bus. Straight, without apparent effort, the posture of a woman for whom the vertical was a default rather than a position. Jarvis in custody, she said. Yes, ma'am. The case intact. FBI has it. The other men accounted for, Sample said. All of them. She nodded. Not the nod of approval, exactly, more the nod of a woman checking items against a list she had made in her head and finding them present. They sat for a while in the particular companionable silence of people who have been through the same sequence of events from different vantage points and don't need to establish that fact out loud. A freight truck pulled out of the diesel pumps, and its engine brake engaged at the lot's exit, and the sound of it went through the morning air like something being torn carefully along a seam. The Border Patrol unit moved from the far end of the lot to the highway and disappeared south. The family with the minivans finished with the air pump and packed their children back in and pulled out in a loose convoy heading west. And Sample watched them go, the rental plates, the camping gear strapped to the roof rack, the rear window where a kid pressed his face against the glass, and watched the gas station recede the way children Watch the world through vehicle windows with the specific mournful attention of someone being carried through it rather than moving through it under their own power. The Ruiz family, Sample said, on the county road. Did they get caught up in any of the? I called them this morning, Mrs. Pruitt said. They're fine. Heard vehicles overnight, but nobody came to the house. Good. I told them what happened. Roughly. What did they say? Miguel, that's the father, said he knew something was wrong with those trucks the first time he saw them on the road. Said they moved like trucks that knew they weren't supposed to be somewhere. She looked at the mountains to the west, going brown in the climbing light. Ranch people notice that kind of thing. They do, Sample said. Another silence. The deli counter woman came out the entrance door on a break, lit a cigarette, looked at the two of them on the parking stop with the unsurprised expression of someone who had seen many kinds of people at many kinds of hours in this parking lot and had stopped assigning categories. Where do you go from here? Mrs. Pruitt said. Sample thought about it. The storage unit in Tucson with 3 years of files. The Monday appointment that was now a Monday that had already happened while he was in a cedar break. And then an ER, and then a parking stop outside a truck stop, which meant the appointment needed to be rescheduled. The El Paso follow-up for the shoulder. In 2 weeks. A motel somewhere between here and there, where he could sleep for 10 hours and eat something that hadn't come from a gas station cooler or a saddlebag. His mind produced the word saddlebag, and he noted that and set it aside. The file in Tucson had new contents now, not just his cross-reference documents and the circled name in red marker on the wall of the Las Cruces Motel room, but the photographs from Swick's burner trans warrant the forensics team's findings on the laptop. The Cayman account records that the Financial Crimes Unit in Dallas was currently examining the testimony of 5 men in various states of medical and legal difficulty who had direct knowledge of Rafter J's operations. The file was going somewhere now. The magistrate in Albuquerque was on administrative leave, and the state attorneys had received calls from the Justice Department and the Aquifer Capital Investor Group had retained 4 law firms and described their transactions as temporarily paused, pending clarification, which was the language of men who had seen what was coming and were trying to outrun it by renaming it. They wouldn't outrun it. Sample knew this the way he knew the things he'd spent 3 years learning, not with the theatrical certainty of a man who needed to believe he was right, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had read enough documents and followed enough money to understand the difference between a system that was intact and a system that had been compromised at its foundation and was now running on momentum. Momentum ran out. Always. It just took time, and time was the one thing Sample had been willing to spend when most of the people involved had assumed he'd spend it on something else. Tucson, he said. Eventually. I've got a follow-up. In El Paso first. He looked at the sling. And some time in a motel somewhere between here and there where I can stop moving for a few days. You have people in El Paso? A colleague. Former. He thought about Tran in the hallway of the the wire-rimmed glasses and the 20 hours of wakefulness, organized around itself. A few, maybe. Mrs. Pruitt picked up her coffee and drank it with the considering expression of a woman who had a question and was deciding whether the question needed to be asked or whether it had already been answered. And she was just confirming the answer. "You going to keep doing this?" she said. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the parking lot, the freight trucks and the families in the border patrol, and the man with the cattle trailer who was still drinking from his thermos with the unhurried authority of a man who had decided this specific spot was where he was going to be for a while, and the world could accommodate that or not. He looked at the mountains going brown in the climbing morning light, and the sky going from white toward the pale blue. That was as close to blue as the desert sky got before the heat turned it back to white. He thought about what this was. 3 years of documents in a storage unit. A name circled in red marker. A bus seat in the back row out of habit. A ranch gate code scratched onto the back of a folded piece of paper with a multi-tools all. A man coming down a barn ladder because the arithmetic was finished and he knew it. "I'm not going to keep doing this specific thing," Sample said. "This specific thing is done." Mrs. Pruitt looked at him. "But," she said. "But there are other files," he said. "Other storage units, I guess, in some sense." He looked at the mountains. The aquifer situation isn't the only aquifer situation. There are 6 other counties in 3 other states where the same investors are running the same play under different names, and I've had documents on 2 of them for a year and a half that I haven't had time to cross-reference because I was cross-referencing these ones. Mrs. Pruitt was quiet. "Tran knows about the other counties," Sample said. "She's known for a while. But the institutional bandwidth is what it is, and the institutional bandwidth doesn't always move at the speed of what's actually happening on the ground." He paused. "Which is where I seem to keep ending up." "On the ground," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the mountains with the long, level attention of a woman who had spent 50 years in country that required you to take the long view or it would defeat you, and who had arrived at the long view without finding it comforting or discouraging. Just accurate. "My husband," she said, "spent 30 years running cattle on land that was marginal to begin with, and got worse every decade. When people asked him why he kept doing it, he'd say the same thing every time." Sample waited. He'd say, "Because it needs doing and I know how." She picked up her coffee and stood up from the parking stop with the easy economy of a woman whose body still did what she asked it to, and she looked down at Sample with the expression she'd had on the bus when she'd told him the Ruiz family's ranch road, the deliberate, unsentimental assessment of a woman confirming what she'd already assessed. "Get your shoulder fixed," she said. "That's the plan. And eat something that didn't come from a vending machine." She looked at the Stripes entrance. "They make a breakfast burrito in there that's actually edible. Ask for the green chili on the side, or it overwhelms everything." She picked up her government-issue coffee cup and walked toward Trans-Suburban and said something to the agent standing beside it and got in the back seat. And the door closed, and that was all. Sample sat on the parking stop. The morning continued its quiet accumulation. He thought about the other files, the other counties, the particular quality of patience required to spend 3 years cross-referencing documents in a storage unit in Tucson while the thing you were documenting kept operating, kept acquiring, kept moving the money through the channels it had bought and the people it had compromised right up until the morning it couldn't anymore. He thought about getting on a bus. He thought about a wet shoulder and a missing button, and the way the bus smelled like recirculated regret, which it had, and how that was where this particular version of this particular story had started on a Greyhound on I-10 in July with a man across the aisle, explaining water rights to someone named Derek, and a woman in the seat ahead who held herself like a fence post, and a young man watching the desert with the patience of someone who understood that distances in this country were not poetic, they were just distances, and you waited them out. He thought about the aquifer under 6 counties, patient and old, and indifferent in the dark below. Everything. He stood up. His shoulder reported its status, and he filed it. His knee, which had held all night without incident, registered a faint preliminary complaint that said the night's work had accumulated somewhere and would present its bill on a schedule of its own choosing. He filed that too. He picked up the cold coffee cup and walked to the trash barrel by the entrance door and dropped it in. And he went inside and stood at the deli counter and looked at the woman behind it, who was already looking at him with the equable, unhurried attention of someone who had been assembling breakfast burritos since 4 a.m. and found nothing about the next customer particularly surprising. Green chili on the side, he said. She reached for a tortilla. He stood at the counter and waited and watched through the plate glass window as Tran came out of the second Suburban and crossed the lot toward the entrance, her notebook open, and behind her Okafor with his mechanical pencil and his small notebook, and behind them the Pecos County unit pulling out of the lot and heading north, back up 285 toward the country that was already reorganizing itself around the night's events, settling back into its distances and its silences and its patient disregard for whatever the people moving through it thought they were accomplishing. The deli counter woman set a wrapped burrito and a small container of green chili on the counter. Coffee, she said. Please, Sample said. She poured it. He took the burrito and the coffee and the green chili to the concrete parking stop outside the entrance and sat down in the climbing morning heat and ate, and Tran came out and sat beside him with her notebook and said, "Ready?" And he said, "Give me 5 minutes." And she looked at the burrito and said, "Take 10, and he ate and drank the coffee while it was still hot. And the sky went from white to the pale blue that was as blue as it would get, and the freight trucks moved on the highway, and the world ran its ordinary inventory of itself unhurried, the way it always did, without waiting for anyone to finish what they were doing before it moved on to the next thing. He finished the burrito. He drank the last of the coffee. He looked at the mountains. Then he turned to Tran and said, "All right," and she opened her notebook, and they got to work. The end.